"We didn't order for your son," my brother said, sliding a pathetic-looking hot dog toward my 8-year-old Leo while the waiter placed a massive $200 tomahawk steak in front of his own child. He took a sip of his bourbon. "We all know you're struggling on that clerk's salary. He's used to fast food anyway, let's not waste a good wagyu on a kid." My mom chimed in. "You really should have packed him a lunch, Melanie. Your brother pays for everything, don't be a leech." I just smiled, patted Leo's hand and said, "Noted." When the waiter returned, I stood up and made a quiet request. What happened next made my brother's jaw drop and completely destroyed their perfect family facade. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Melanie, and I am 33 years old. I was sitting in one of Chicago's most exclusive 5-star steakhouses, supposedly celebrating Leo's 8th birthday. But as usual, the evening was really about my older brother Brandon and his wife Jasmine. They were the undisputed stars of the family. Brandon, a senior VP at a luxury private wealth management firm, and Jasmine, a socialite heavily involved in charity circles, lived the kind of life my parents worshipped. I, on the other hand, was the single mother, the supposed clerk, the perpetual disappointment. The waiter, looking visibly uncomfortable, had just set down 3 enormous, perfectly seared tomahawk steaks in front of Brandon, Jasmine, and my mother, Catherine. The rich smell of truffles and roasted garlic filled the air. And then there was Leo's plate. A plain hot dog, still slightly sweaty from whatever microwave they had used to heat it, sitting sadly on a stark white plate. Brandon smirked, taking another sip of his $50 scotch. "We didn't order for your son, Mel. We all know you're struggling to make rent on your clerk's salary. He's used to fast food, let's not waste a good wagyu on a kid." Jasmine let out a soft, condescending laugh, adjusting a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the dim restaurant light. "It's true, Melanie. It's better he doesn't get used to things you can't afford to give him." I felt Leo shift uncomfortably next to me, his small hands pulling back from the table. He looked down at his lap. My chest tightened, a familiar mix of anger and the ingrained habit of shrinking myself, threatening to take over. This was the dynamic. It had always been the dynamic. My mother, Catherine, cut into her steak, not even looking up. "You really should have packed him a lunch, Melanie. Your brother pays for everything, don't be a leech. You know he has his gala to pay for next week." They thought they knew everything about me. They thought I was still the struggling girl who had needed help years ago. They had no idea that I hadn't been a clerk in nearly a decade. They didn't know I was the founder and CEO of a highly sought-after corporate crisis management and forensic auditing firm. They definitely didn't know I had just closed a $50 million contract. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I turned to Leo, wiped a smudge from his cheek with my napkin, and smiled warmly. "Don't worry, buddy. We're going to get you something much better." I looked back at Brandon. "Noted," I said calmly. I caught the waiter's eye and waved him back over. He approached tentatively. "Yes, ma'am." "Please take this hot dog away," I said, my voice steady and clear, "and bring my son the chef's reserve ribeye. Medium well. Add the lobster mac and cheese and the truffle fries." The waiter blinked, then nodded quickly. "Right away, ma'am." "And," I added, locking eyes with Brandon, "please split the check. I'll be paying for my son's meal and my own." Brandon scoffed a loud, derisive sound. "Split the check? What are you going to do? Melanie put it on layaway, just let me handle it. I don't want you calling Mom crying tomorrow because your electricity got shut off." He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his sleek metal platinum card, tossing it onto the silver tray the waiter was holding. It hit the metal with a heavy, arrogant clink. "Put their little meal on this too. Consider it charity." I didn't argue. I just sat back and watched. The waiter picked up the card and stepped over to the mobile payment terminal, resting on a nearby serving station. He swiped the heavy metal card. The machine let out a loud, distinct beep. The waiter frowned, hit a few buttons, and swiped it again. Beep. He walked back over, looking deeply apologetic. "I'm sorry, sir. It seems the card has been declined." Brandon's face instantly went rigid. "Declined? That's impossible. Run it again." "I did, sir. Twice. The system says declined." The silence at the table was sudden and absolute. The clinking of silverware stopped. Jasmine's condescending smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panic. My mother stopped chewing. "There must be a mistake with your machine," Brandon said, his voice rising in volume, the composure he so carefully maintained beginning to crack. "Do you know who I am? I manage more money before breakfast than you'll see in a lifetime. Try it again." "I'm very sorry, sir." The waiter maintained his professional tone, though he clearly wanted to be anywhere else. "It's an automated response from the issuer." I picked up my glass of sparkling water, taking a slow sip. The shift in the air was palpable. The untouchable golden child had just hit a wall, and I was sitting right there to watch it happen. The dinner that was supposed to be a showcase of my inadequacies was rapidly turning into something else entirely. The waiter stood perfectly still, holding the payment terminal in the tense silence. Brandon snatched his metal platinum card back as if the plastic itself had suddenly caught fire. He glared at the young waiter, his face turning a blotchy, uneven shade of crimson that clashed horribly with his tailored suit. He loudly declared that the restaurant's system was clearly malfunctioning and demanded to see the manager. He practically shouted that he was a senior vice president of wealth management and that a $2,000 bill was absolute pocket change to a man of his stature. The waiter maintained a painfully polite posture, his voice perfectly even as he offered to key the numbers in manually just in case the magnetic strip was damaged. Brandon aggressively waved him off, muttering about incompetent staff. Jasmine, noticing the lingering stares from the adjacent tables, quickly intervened to protect their precious public image. She offered a tight, artificial smile to the waiter and reached into her quilted Chanel bag. She pulled out a pristine gold rewards card, handing it over with a practiced, elegant flip of her wrist. The waiter swiped it. The machine emitted the exact same sharp, unforgiving beep. Declined. Jasmine's confident smile faltered. She snatched the card back, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the plastic, and produced a second card. This one, a high-tier travel credit card. She thrust it at the terminal. Swiped. Declined. A tiny bead of sweat formed at her temple, ruining her flawless makeup. She tried a third card, her hands visibly shaking now as she jammed it into the chip reader herself, muttering about bank security freezes on large purchases. The digital screen flashed a bright red error message. Insufficient funds. The heavy silence that blanketed our table was deafening. The surrounding patrons in the upscale Chicago steakhouse had entirely stopped their quiet conversations to watch the spectacle of the city's supposed elite failing to buy their own extravagant dinner. My mother, Catherine, sat paralyzed for exactly 5 seconds before her deeply ingrained survival instincts kicked in. In her world, Brandon could never be at fault. Jasmine could never be at fault. Therefore, there was only one logical target for her immediate and intense public humiliation. She leaned across the pristine white tablecloth, her eyes narrowing into sharp, judgmental slits. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, completely ignoring the fact that my 8-year-old son was sitting right next to me watching her every move. She hissed that I had brought my toxic, poverty-stricken energy to the table. She accused me of jinxing the evening on purpose because I was bitter about my own miserable, solitary life. Then she slammed her hand flat on the table, rattling the expensive crystal water glasses and causing Leo to flinch. "Pay the bill right now, Melanie," she demanded. Her voice was a venomous whisper meant to stay under the radar of the other diners, but the sheer hateful force of it carried across the aisle. She aggressively reminded me that they had graciously paid for my community college classes years ago before I so selfishly dropped out and threw my entire future away. She told me I owed them this dinner. She told me I owed my brother for even gracing me with his presence tonight. I looked at the three of them. Brandon was staring at his lap, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. Jasmine was aggressively refreshing her mobile banking app on her phone, her breathing shallow and fast. My mother was glaring at me with unfiltered raw disdain. For the first time in my entire life, their collective judgment felt like absolutely nothing. It held no power over me. I did not justify myself. I did not remind her that I had paid them back for those basic classes a decade ago. I simply reached into my minimalist, unbranded leather purse. I bypassed the standard debit cards and pulled out a solid black heavy titanium card. It was an invite-only Centurion card, a piece of metal that required an enormous annual spending limit and massive liquid assets just to possess. The waiter's eyes widened the second he saw it. Working in a high-end establishment, he knew exactly what that dark metal represented. I held it out. He took it with both hands, tapped it against the machine, and a cheerful melodic chime immediately signaled an approved transaction. I signed the electronic screen, adding a very generous tip for his trouble and patience. Then I looked directly into my mother's shocked, wide eyes. I kept my voice perfectly level, ensuring every single word landed with maximum undeniable impact. I did not drop out, Mom. I transferred to an Ivy League university on a full academic scholarship right after Dad secretly drained my college trust fund to buy Brandon his first BMW. The color completely drained from Catherine's face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Brandon finally jerked his head up, his eyes wide with panic, looking frantically between me and our mother. I did not stay to watch the fallout of my statement. I stood up smoothly, adjusting my tailored coat, and reached down to take Leo's hand. He looked up at me, his eyes bright and completely calm, trusting me entirely. We walked away from the table, our footsteps echoing softly on the hardwood floor of the restaurant. I left them sitting there with their massive unpaid steaks, their declined plastic cards, and their suddenly shattered illusions of superiority. The cool, crisp Chicago night air hit my face as we stepped out of the heavy glass doors and approached the valet stand. I handed the attendant my ticket, feeling a profound sense of peace and vindication wash over me. That peace lasted exactly 40 seconds. Rapid, aggressive footsteps clicked loudly on the pavement behind me. Jasmine marched out of the restaurant, bypassing the doorman entirely. Her face was twisted in a mixture of raw rage and absolute panic. She was breathing heavily, her designer heels scraping against the concrete as she closed the distance between us. She grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around violently. In her other hand, she held up a crumpled, official-looking piece of paper. It must have slipped out of my purse when I reached for my wallet inside the restaurant. She shoved the paper right into my face, her voice trembling with barely suppressed fury. "What the hell is this?" I shifted my weight, gently guiding Leo behind my legs to shield him from her erratic, manic energy. The paper quivering in Jasmine's fist was unmistakably official. It was a notice of default. The bank had securely transmitted the original file to my firm for a preliminary asset audit just yesterday, and a printed copy must have slipped from my portfolio when I retrieved my wallet inside the restaurant. Jasmine thrust the crumpled document closer to my face, her expensive floral perfume entirely failing to mask the sour scent of her rising panic. She let out a sharp, breathless scoff that sounded more like a choke. "Trying to scare us with fake documents," she sneered, her voice trembling as she desperately tried to maintain her air of superiority. "Do you honestly think anyone would believe this garbage? My husband makes 7 figures, Melanie. We are in a completely different tax bracket. We operate in a world you cannot even comprehend." I looked calmly at the paper, then back at her frantic eyes. Jasmine took my silence as an opportunity to double down on her attack, her volume rising to ensure the nearby valet attendants could hear her assertions of wealth. "Do not even think about showing your face at my charity gala this weekend," she commanded, her face contorting into an ugly sneer. "I am hosting the most influential philanthropists and socialites in Chicago. I will not have you wandering around in your cheap clothes trying to mingle with my high society friends. You are not welcome. Your poverty is contagious, and I refuse to let your pathetic life drag down our family image." She paused to catch her breath, her eyes darting down to the sleek, unbranded leather tote resting on my shoulder. It was a custom hand-stitched piece imported from Milan, worth more than her entire ensemble, but to a woman whose identity relied entirely on flashy, recognizable logos, it registered as completely worthless. She pointed a long acrylic nail at my bag. Look at you carrying around a Canal Street knockoff while trying to pass off fake bank notices. Brandon told me exactly what kind of person you are. He told me how you came crying to his office last November begging him for a loan to cover your rent. He is far too generous for his own good. He gave you a massive handout because he felt sorry for you. And this is how you repay him. By printing out fabricated foreclosure notices to humiliate him in public. You are a bitter, jealous leech. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power never has to shout. I reached out and firmly took the crumpled document from her trembling fingers. I smoothed out the creases with deliberate slow motions, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her shift uncomfortably on her designer heels. I did not beg for a loan, Jasmine, I said, my voice cutting through the crisp night air with absolute clarity. Last November, I went to his office to demand the return of the $50,000 he drained from my grandmother's educational trust, the trust that was legally established for Leo. Jasmine recoiled slightly, her eyes narrowing as she tried to process the information. She opened her mouth to argue, but I did not give her the chance. He did not give me a handout. I continued stepping just a fraction of an inch closer to her. He wrote me a hush money check that bounced 3 days later because his accounts were already overdrawn. And as for this document, I held the smoothed paper up to the bright lights of the valet stand. This is not a fake notice. Look at the letterhead. Look at the loan origination date. Jasmine's eyes flicked to the paper, refusing to focus on the words, but I read them for her. It lists the property address of your primary residence in Highland Park, I stated clearly. It outlines a severe past due balance spanning 6 consecutive months. It has Brandon's digital signature right there on the bottom line. He has not paid the mortgage on your multi-million-dollar mansion in half a year, Jasmine. The bank is taking your home. The blood completely vanished from her face. The aggressive high society persona shattered instantly, leaving behind a terrified woman staring at the undeniable proof of her impending ruin. Her mouth opened, but she was entirely speechless, her mind violently rejecting the reality I had just handed her. Before the truth could fully sink in, the heavy oak doors of the steakhouse burst open with a loud, violent bang. Brandon stormed out onto the pavement. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, his previous embarrassment entirely replaced by aggressive hostility. He spotted us standing near the curb and closed the distance in long, menacing strides. The valet attendants immediately stepped back, their relaxed postures vanishing as they sensed the sudden threat of physical violence. He lunged forward completely, ignoring his wife's pale, shocked face, and grabbed my arm with a crushing grip. His fingers dug painfully into my jacket, his breath hot and smelling of expensive bourbon as he leaned down into my face. "You listen to me, you little nobody." His fingers bit into the fabric of my tailored coat, the pressure bruising my skin through the thick wool. I could smell the expensive aged bourbon mixed with the metallic scent of his nervous sweat. He leaned in so close I could see the burst capillaries in his eyes, his meticulously groomed exterior completely unraveling right there on the sidewalk. "I am a senior vice president of private wealth," Brandon hissed, his spit practically hitting my cheek. "I manage portfolios worth more than your entire pathetic existence. You are a glorified paper pusher, a temp clerk who got lucky with a high-limit credit card today. Do you think a piece of black plastic makes you my equal? If you ever disrespect my wife, my wallet, or my standing in this city again, I will make one phone call, just one, and I will have you permanently blacklisted from every single accounting firm, every bank, and every corporate office in the state of Illinois. You will not be able to get a job doing taxes at a strip mall by the time I am finished with you." Before I could even pry his fingers off my arm, a heavy hand clamped down on my other shoulder. It was my father, William. He had just exited the restaurant, his cashmere overcoat draped perfectly over his shoulders, looking every bit the distinguished patriarch of a wealthy Chicago family. But his eyes held zero warmth for me. He did not pull his out-of-control son away. Instead, he squeezed my shoulder hard, forcing me to stay locked in my brother's aggressive, bruising grip. "Apologize to your brother right this second, Melanie," my father demanded. His voice was a low, authoritative rumble that used to terrify me when I was a child. He is the pillar of this family. He single-handedly maintains our reputation in this city. You are nothing but a single mother trying to ride his coattails to a lifestyle you cannot possibly maintain on your own. You humiliate him inside over a hot dog. You embarrass Jasmine out here over a clerical error on a bank notice. You are a bitter, ungrateful burden. Apologize right now, and maybe he will forgive this disgusting display of jealousy. Do you have any idea the pressure Brandon is under? William continued, pointing a stern, perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. He carries the financial weight of this entire family. He pays for the country club memberships. He funds your mother's charity events. The least you can do is show some respect instead of waving around fake documents like a spiteful teenager. We should never have invited you tonight. I looked at the two men boxing me in on the pavement. The two men who had spent 33 years making me feel completely invisible, treating me as a financial liability, while praising a man who was secretly stealing from everyone around him. I felt Leo's small, warm hand gripping the back of my coat, seeking shelter from the hostility of his own grandfather and uncle. I took a slow, steady breath, letting the icy Chicago wind cool the anger burning in my chest. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not revert to the scared little girl they desperately wanted me to be. I looked down at Brandon's hand gripping my arm. With a swift, precise motion, I drove my thumb hard into the nerve cluster just below his wrist. Brandon let out a sharp, breathless gasp, his grip breaking instantly as he stumbled back, massaging his hand in absolute shock. I stepped out of my father's reach, placing myself squarely between their toxic energy and my son. "Careful, Brandon," I said, my voice eerily calm against the backdrop of blaring city traffic and the hushed whispers of the valet attendants watching the spectacle. A pillar only looks strong until you realize the foundation is completely rotten. I adjusted my coat, smoothing out the wrinkles his violent grip had caused. "You think you rule the financial sector of this city?" I continued, my words sharp and deliberate. "You think you are untouchable because you throw around other people's money and hide behind a corporate title. But you are careless. You are incredibly sloppy. You leave digital footprints a first-year accounting student could follow." My father scoffed loudly, crossing his arms over his chest. "Listen to yourself, Melanie. You sound completely deranged. You need psychiatric help." I ignored him entirely, keeping my eyes locked dead onto my brother's pale, sweating face. "I highly suggest you check your work email, Brandon," I said softly. "Right now. I think your internal compliance department is looking for you, and they are not very happy." Brandon opened his mouth to hurl another insult, his chest puffing out as he prepared to laugh off my warning and reassert his dominance. But before a single sound could escape his lips, his phone erupted with a loud, aggressive buzzing from inside his breast pocket. Then my father's phone buzzed in his overcoat. A second later, Jasmine's phone started ringing frantically from inside her quilted designer bag. Brandon slowly reached into his jacket, his arrogant posture deflated instantly as he pulled out the device. The harsh blue light of the screen illuminated his terrified features in the dark. He stared at the screen, and the blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost standing perfectly still under the streetlights. That Friday night, Brandon did not say another word. He simply shoved his phone back into his pocket, turned on his heel, and practically dragged Jasmine toward the valet stand, leaving my father standing alone on the sidewalk. He spent the entire weekend completely off the grid, ignoring my mother's frantic texts and pretending everything was perfectly fine. But by Monday morning, the fragile, luxurious reality he had constructed was violently tearing at the seams. The morning sun reflected harshly off the floor-to-ceiling windows of Brandon's corner office at Sterling Trust Financial. Situated on the 45th floor, the office was a monument to his ego. Custom mahogany desk, imported Italian leather chairs, and a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. Usually this view made him feel like a king. Today it just made him feel exposed. Brandon sat at his desk, sweating profusely. Dark, damp patches were already blooming under the arms of his tailored Tom Ford shirt. He slammed his fingers against his mechanical keyboard, typing in his credentials for the 5th time in 3 minutes. The screen blinked, loading for a fraction of a second, before displaying the same stark, unforgiving message in bold red text. Access denied. Account suspended. Please contact Global Compliance. He grabbed his desk phone, his hands shaking so violently he knocked over his empty espresso cup. He dialed his private offshore broker, a man who usually answered before the second ring. It went straight to a generic automated voicemail. He slammed the receiver down, his breathing growing shallow and erratic. He tried to log into his personal banking portal on his phone. Frozen. He tried his corporate expense account. Locked. Panic, cold and sharp, gripped his chest. He stood up, pacing the length of his massive office. He needed a scapegoat. He needed a logical explanation that did not end with him in federal prison. His mind raced, frantically connecting dots until he landed on the only target that made sense in his distorted worldview. Melanie. It had to be Melanie. She had openly threatened him in the parking lot. She had shown Jasmine that foreclosure notice. She had specifically mentioned his compliance department. Brandon's panic rapidly morphed into explosive, self-righteous rage. He convinced himself that I had somehow used my low-level accounting job to access Sterling Trust's external portal and file a fake whistleblower report. I was just a bitter, jealous sister trying to sabotage his brilliant career because I was stuck in a dead-end clerk position. I was trying to scare him. He decided right then and there that I was going to pay. He would not just get me fired, he would completely destroy my reputation. Brandon stormed out of his corner office, marching past his terrified executive assistant without a word. He bypassed the panoramic glass elevators reserved for senior partners and jammed his finger into the button for the service lift. He was heading down to the 12th floor, the windowless, fluorescent-lit basement of the firm where the entry-level analyst, temp clerks, and junior accountants were housed, the grunt floor. When the elevator doors dinged open, he practically sprinted down the narrow corridor, ignoring the startled looks of the junior staff. He threw open the heavy wooden doors to the Human Resources Department, the loud bang echoing through the quiet reception area. Diane, the senior director of HR, looked up from her dual monitors. She was a no-nonsense woman with sharp glasses and zero tolerance for executive tantrums. Brandon slammed his palms flat onto Diane's desk, leaning over her aggressively. "I want her gone, Diane," Brandon demanded, his voice echoing in the small office. "I want her security badge deactivated, I want her corporate access revoked, and I want her escorted out of this building by security immediately." Diane blinked, completely unbothered by his aggressive posturing. She calmly adjusted her glasses. "Good morning to you too, Brandon. Who exactly are we terminating today?" Melanie. Brandon spat out, his face flushed with anger. "Melanie from the lower-level accounting pool, the temp clerk. She is my sister, and she has clearly lost her mind. She filed a fraudulent, malicious grievance against me with the compliance board over the weekend. It is corporate sabotage, it is insubordination, and it is grounds for immediate termination. Fire her right now, or I will involve the legal team and have the firm sue her for defamation." Diane stared at him. The initial flash of annoyance on her face slowly dissolved into a look of utter, profound confusion. She moved her mouse, clicking open the employee database on her right monitor. She typed in my name, hitting the enter key with a sharp clack. She scanned the screen, frowned, and typed it in again. "Brandon," Diane said slowly, her voice completely devoid of its usual corporate warmth. "There is no Melanie in the accounting pool. We do not have any temporary clerks by that name working in this building." Brandon scoffed, throwing his hands up in the air in pure exasperation. "Check the external contractor list. Check the payroll database. I know she works here. She explicitly told me she was auditing accounts for this firm. Just find her file and terminate her." Diane stopped typing. She slowly removed her hands from the keyboard and folded them neatly on her desk. She looked up at Brandon, her expression shifting from confusion to a sudden, terrifying realization. The color began to drain from her own face as she finally understood exactly who Brandon was talking about. "Brandon," Diane said, her voice dropping to a hushed, incredibly tense whisper. "Melanie does not work for us. She does not work for anybody." Brandon sneered, leaning in closer. "Then what the hell is she doing in this building?" Diane stood up slowly. She did not answer him directly. Instead, she walked around her desk and moved toward the large interior window of her office, which overlooked the massive multi-story open atrium of the Sterling Trust building. She pointed a trembling finger directly upward toward the 46th floor, the exclusive glass-walled executive boardroom that hovered above the entire firm. "Look up," Diane instructed softly. Brandon stepped up to the glass and tilted his head back. Through the pristine soundproof glass walls of the boardroom above, he could see the entire C-suite executive team. The CEO, the chief legal counsel, and the head of global compliance were all seated around the massive marble table. Standing at the head of that table, wearing a razor-sharp charcoal suit and holding a laser pointer directed at a massive projection screen filled with highlighted banking discrepancies, was me. She is the external forensic auditor, the CEO hired from Washington last month. Diane whispered, her voice filled with absolute dread. She is currently presenting a criminal embezzlement case to the board. Brandon stood completely frozen for 3 seconds, his brain short-circuiting as he stared up at the glass-walled boardroom. Then a raw, primal survival instinct warped by years of unchecked arrogance and entitlement completely took over. He did not ask Diane another question. He turned on his heel and sprinted toward the executive stairwell. His expensive Italian leather shoes slammed aggressively against the concrete steps as he took them 2 at a time, his breathing ragged, his silk tie flying over his shoulder. He was going to stop this. He was going to expose me as a fraud before Jonathan, the notoriously ruthless CEO of Sterling Trust, could process whatever fabricated lies I was selling. He hit the 46th floor and shoved past the executive assistant, completely ignoring her panicked protests and demands that he stop. He threw his entire body weight against the heavy frosted glass doors of the primary boardroom, bursting into the room like a localized hurricane. The heavy oak doors slammed against the wall stoppers with a violent, echoing crack that shattered the quiet corporate atmosphere. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Jonathan sat at the head of the massive, polished mahogany table, his hands steeped under his chin, his face a mask of absolute fury. Flanking him were the chief legal counsel and the head of global compliance, both looking physically ill as they stared at the documents in front of them. And standing perfectly poised at the front of the room, directing a green laser pointer at a complex financial flowchart projected onto the wall, was me. Brandon did not wait for an invitation to speak. He marched straight toward the presentation screen, his face a blotchy, sweat-drenched mess of panic and rage. "Jonathan, you have to stop listening to her right now!" he shouted, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me, his chest heaving. "She is a fraud. She is my unstable, vindictive sister. She does not even work here. She is a temp clerk who is currently experiencing a psychotic break because she is insanely jealous of my success. She is fabricating this entire presentation to ruin my career because she is broke and bitter." Jonathan did not blink. He slowly lowered his hands, his icy glare locking onto Brandon. He did not look confused by the sudden intrusion. He looked like a predator assessing a trapped, desperate animal. Brandon, misinterpreting the heavy silence, kept talking, digging his professional grave deeper with every single word. He rambled about the steakhouse, about the foreclosure notice I had supposedly printed out to humiliate his wife Jasmine, and about how I had hacked the system to get back at him for refusing to give me a personal loan to cover my rent. I did not interrupt his frantic, unhinged monologue. I did not even look at him. I simply clicked the button on my presentation remote. The massive screen behind me shifted from a complex web of transactions to a single, highly magnified document. It was a wire transfer authorization form bearing a digital signature. I stepped forward and slid a thick red-tabbed file across the smooth mahogany table. It stopped precisely an inch from Jonathan's hands. "As you can see on page 42 of the preliminary audit report," I said, my voice projecting a calm, unwavering authority that immediately commanded the room. "The $3 million missing from your top-tier clients' offshore accounts was not lost to market fluctuation or poor investment strategy. It was systematically siphoned over a period of 14 consecutive months. The funds were funneled through a meticulously layered shell corporation using dummy invoices for consulting services that never actually existed. I tapped my laser pointer against the screen, circling a specific tax identification number. A shell, LLC, that according to these state registry documents and corresponding bank routing numbers, is legally registered to the Jasmine Foundation. I stated clearly, looking directly at the CEO. That is a charity organization wholly owned and operated by Brandon's wife. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The chief legal counsel flipped open the file I had provided, his eyes scanning the irrefutable paper trail. The bank statements, the IP addresses tracking the transfers directly to Brandon's secure office terminal, the corresponding deposits into Jasmine's charity accounts. It was bulletproof. It was the exact reason Sterling Trust had bypassed their internal auditors and secretly hired my crisis management firm to conduct a sweeping forensic investigation. Brandon stared at the glowing screen, the breath completely knocked out of his lungs. His mouth opened and closed, but his usual arsenal of slick excuses and corporate jargon entirely failed him. He looked at Jonathan, his eyes pleading, begging for the benefit of the doubt that his golden child status had always afforded him in our family. "Jonathan, I can explain," Brandon stammered, his voice dropping to a pathetic, trembling whisper. "It is a clerical error, a misallocation of charitable funds. I can move the money back by Friday. I swear I can fix this." Jonathan stood up slowly. He adjusted his suit jacket, his expression radiating absolute unfiltered disgust. He glared at Brandon, his voice cold, sharp, and definitive. "You do not have until Friday," Jonathan stated, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "You do not have until noon. You are suspended immediately without pay, pending a full criminal investigation. We have already contacted the authorities." Before Brandon could even process the weight of those words, the heavy boardroom doors opened again. Two large, uniformed corporate security officers stepped into the room, flanked by two detectives in sharp suits holding silver badges. Brandon tried to back away, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, but the security officers moved with practiced, rigid efficiency. They grabbed him by the arms, firmly twisting him around to escort him out of the executive suite. As they forcefully marched him toward the glass elevators, his polished corporate composure completely disintegrated. He thrashed against their grip, twisting his head to glare at me over his shoulder. His face was a mask of unhinged, desperate fury, his eyes wide with the realization that his entire life was over. "Mom and Dad are going to destroy you for this," he screamed, his voice echoing violently down the pristine hallway as the heavy glass doors slammed shut behind him. The quiet hum of my apartment was a jarring contrast to the absolute chaos I had just unleashed at Sterling Trust. I stood at the kitchen island staring down at a cooling cup of coffee, the massive surge of adrenaline from the morning finally beginning to recede. At the dining table, my 7-year-old son Leo was diligently working on his math worksheet, his small brow furrowed in deep concentration. The soft, rhythmic scratch of his pencil against the paper was the only sound in the room. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the safety and sanctuary of my own space wash over me. The forensic audit was complete. Brandon's reign of terror, his corporate embezzlement, and his financial abuse had been exposed to the highest levels of corporate compliance and federal authorities. The nightmare was finally over, or so I foolishly thought. The heavy, rapid pounding on my front door shattered the domestic peace instantly. Before I could even cross the living room to look through the peephole, the door violently swung open. Catherine, my mother, stood on the threshold. She had clearly used the emergency spare key I had given her years ago, a key she had never once used to visit her grandson or check on my well-being. Her usually immaculate, salon-styled hair was disheveled, and her expensive designer trench coat was thrown hastily over her shoulders, buttoned incorrectly. She did not pause to greet me. She did not ask how my day was or inquire if I was recovering from the intense hostility of our weekend encounter. Her frantic eyes swept the room, landing entirely on her grandson. She marched past me as if I were merely a piece of furniture, her hard heels clicking aggressively against the floorboards, heading straight for Leo's room down the hall. I watched in stunned silence as she reappeared seconds later, carrying Leo's overnight duffel bag. She marched over to the coat rack, hastily pulling his school jacket off the hook, and grabbing a pair of his sneakers, shoving them carelessly into the bag. "Mom, what on earth are you doing?" I demanded, stepping directly into her path. "Pack his homework," Catherine snapped, entirely ignoring my question. Her voice was sharp, frantic, and laced with an absolute unhinged panic. "Leo is coming to stay with your father and me for the week. You are coming with me to the bank. Right this second. Get your coat." I stared at her, planting my feet firmly on the hardwood floor. "Nobody is going anywhere. Put his bag down. Put his bag." Catherine dropped the bag, but not out of compliance. She dropped it to free her hands so she could gesture wildly in my face, invading my personal space. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" she shrieked, her voice echoing harshly off the apartment walls. "Brandon is in federal custody. The police raided his office. He was escorted out in handcuffs in front of the entire firm. He is in serious trouble because of your malicious, vindictive lies." She stepped closer, her face flushed with a terrifying, desperate anger. "Your father and I spent the last 3 hours on the phone with a top-tier criminal defense attorney. Do you know what a federal retainer costs? We are putting our house up as collateral to secure a massive secondary loan to bail your brother out. But because the banking system is investigating his accounts, the underwriters require proof of external liquid assets to expedite the approval. You are going to the bank with me, and you are going to co-sign the loan." I looked at the woman who had spent 33 years prioritizing my brother's comfort over my basic existence. She was fully prepared to leverage her entire financial future and mine to save a man who had been actively stealing from charities and clients. "You owe this to the family, Melanie." Catherine continued, her voice reaching a fever pitch. "You were always the difficult child. You were always jealous of him, always trying to ruin things for your brother, because you could never measure up to his success. You threw a tantrum over a hot dog, you humiliated him in public, and now you have fabricated corporate documents to get him arrested. You have destroyed this family's reputation, and now you are going to fix it." I glanced over at Leo. He had stopped writing entirely. His pencil was frozen on the paper, his eyes wide with fear, as he watched his grandmother scream at his mother. The toxic dynamic of my childhood was playing out right in front of him, and I felt a fierce, protective instinct rise in my chest. "Go to your room, Leo," I said quietly, keeping my eyes locked dead on Catherine. "Take your homework, go to your room, and close the door." Once I heard the soft click of his bedroom door shutting, isolating him from the madness, I turned my full, undivided attention back to the frantic woman standing in my kitchen. I stepped squarely between her and the hallway, forming an impenetrable physical barrier she could not pass. "I am not co-signing a single document," I said, my voice eerily calm against the backdrop of her hysteria. "I am not giving you a dime, and I am certainly not letting you take my son to your house while you manage the fallout of your golden child's federal crimes." Catherine scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound of pure disbelief. "You do not have a choice. You will come to that bank and you will sign those papers, or your father and I will make sure you are blacklisted in this city. We are using the family home, the home that provided for you, and as a member of this family, you will shoulder your portion of the financial burden to save your brother." I shook my head slowly, feeling an overwhelming sense of pity mixed with absolute finality. "You can't use your house as collateral, Mom." Catherine's eyes widened in fury. The very idea that I was denying her command, that I was refusing to sacrifice myself for Brandon one last time, short-circuited her brain. Without a single second of hesitation, she raised her hand and struck me hard across the face. The slap echoed sharply in the quiet apartment. The physical sting radiated instantly across my cheekbone, hot and sharp. She stood there, her chest heaving, her hand still raised in the air, fully expecting me to cower, to cry, to revert to the subservient, frightened daughter she had trained me to be. "I am your mother," Catherine hissed, her face contorted with pure, unfiltered rage. "You will do exactly as I say." The physical impact would have shattered me a year ago. It would have broken my resolve and sent me spiraling into apologies. Today, it barely registered. I did not raise my hand to soothe my cheek. I did not step back. I did not flinch. I slowly turned my head back to look at her, my eyes burning with a cold, unrelenting fire that finally matched the authority I had wielded in that boardroom. "You don't own that house anymore, Mom." The blood drained completely from Catherine's face, leaving her perfectly applied blush looking like a garish, artificial stain against her pale skin. Her hand dropped slowly to her side, the fingers trembling. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. She was desperately trying to process the impossible reality. Brandon had assured her the house was safe. He had sworn the second mortgage was a temporary measure for a lucrative real estate flip. He had lied to her face just as he had lied to his clients. I did not give her the opportunity to form a coherent sentence or launch into another hysterical tirade. I grabbed her by the elbow, my grip firm and uncompromising, and physically steered her toward the front door. She stumbled over her designer heels, her arrogant posture entirely deflated. I shoved her out into the hallway, locked the deadbolt with a loud definitive click, and leaned against the heavy wood. My cheek throbbed violently, a hot, radiating reminder of exactly who these people were. I walked down the hall and gently pushed open Leo's door. He was sitting cross-legged on his bed, wearing his oversized headphones, completely engrossed in a colorful racing game on his tablet. He was safe. He was shielded from the toxic fallout of my family. I quietly closed his door and walked back to the kitchen. There was no time to dwell on the physical sting of my mother's slap. I needed to burn the rest of their corrupt empire to the ground. I sat down at the dining table and opened my encrypted laptop. The Sterling Trust remote server was still active on my screen. Brandon's dramatic suspension had triggered a mandatory internal freeze across his department, but my high-level administrative credentials granted me unrestricted, invisible access to the deepest financial archives of the firm. I poured a glass of cold water and stared at the sterile blue light of the monitor. Something about Brandon's embezzlement scheme had been bothering me since the boardroom presentation. He was reckless. He was arrogant. But he was not a sophisticated criminal mastermind. Embezzling $3 million from high-net-worth offshore accounts required far more than just falsified invoices and a brazen attitude. Sterling Trust possessed a mandatory dual authentication protocol for any wire transfer exceeding $500,000. Brandon simply could not have bypassed the bank's stringent security algorithms alone. The system demanded a secondary guarantor. It required a financial anchor with absolutely flawless credit and significant collateral to act as a silent verifying backer for the initial shell company. Brandon was drowning in hidden debt from maintaining his lavish country club lifestyle. His personal credit was a fragile house of cards. He absolutely needed a wealthy cosigner to legitimize the fake charity front. I ran a complex reverse trace on the original incorporation documents for the Jasmine Foundation, the exact shell entity Brandon had utilized to funnel the stolen money. I bypassed the recent heavily doctored ledgers and dug straight back into the raw archive, targeting the exact date the LLC was established 7 years ago. The encrypted file took an agonizing 20 seconds to decode. Finally, a scanned PDF materialized on my screen. It was a primary collateral guarantee form. I zoomed in on the bottom of the digital page. There, rendered in stark, undeniable black ink, was my father's signature. William. He had personally guaranteed Brandon's fraudulent shell company, but my father was a notoriously tight-fisted, calculated man. He would never risk his own precious retirement accounts or his heavily leveraged real estate portfolio. I shifted my focus to the asset column to see exactly what collateral William had pledged to the bank. My blood turned to absolute ice. The routing prefix did not belong to my father's personal wealth management accounts. It belonged to a highly specific, protected offshore trust. It was the irrevocable trust established by my late grandfather, Theodore. The trust was explicitly designed to secure my future, my college education, and my financial stability. My grandfather was the only person in the family who saw through William's blatant favoritism, and he had set up the account to ensure I would never have to rely on my parents. The digital ledger told the entire sickening, heartbreaking story. 7 years ago, Brandon had not just made a bad investment. The bank records showed a massive immediate liquidation of the trust to cover a staggering offshore gambling debt. Brandon was in over his head with a dangerous syndicate. William, exploiting a legal loophole as the primary executor of the trust before I turned 30, had deliberately signed away my entire inheritance. He sacrificed my financial security to save his golden boy from facing criminal charges or physical harm. They had completely stolen my future to protect Brandon's pristine reputation. They had looked me in the eye for 7 consecutive years. They had watched me struggle to pay rent for a tiny apartment. They had watched me work grueling double shifts as a single mother. They had constantly called me a failure and a financial burden, fully knowing they had completely drained the safety net my grandfather had lovingly built for me. A cold, terrifying calm settled over my entire body. There was no sadness left inside me. There was no hesitation. There was only a precise, calculated determination to ensure William faced the exact same federal scrutiny and prison time as his precious son. I reached for my mouse, preparing to download the entire unredacted ledger directly to the FBI task force portal. I was going to ruin him. Before my finger could click the final submission button, my cell phone erupted with a harsh, blaring ringtone across the wooden table. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim kitchen. Oak Ridge Elementary. It was Leo's school. I snatched the phone, my maternal instincts instantly overriding the financial investigation. I swiped the screen to answer, pressing the speaker to my ear. "This is Melanie," I said, my voice sharp and immediately alert. "Miss Wilson, this is Mrs. Higgins from the front office." The school secretary's voice was trembling tight with an unmistakable layer of sheer panic. "I am so incredibly sorry to disturb you, but we have a very serious situation in the lobby right now. Your father, William, is here. He is demanding that we release Leo to him immediately. He claims there is a massive family emergency and that you explicitly sent him to collect your son." I stood up so fast my heavy wooden chair crashed backward onto the floor, the loud bang echoing in the kitchen. "Is Leo with you?" I demanded, grabbing my car keys from the counter with a shaking hand. "Yes, he is safely locked in the principal's office with me," Mrs. Higgins replied, her breathing sounding shallow and fast over the speaker. "But your father is getting incredibly aggressive. He is slamming his hands on the reception desk and threatening to call the police if we do not hand your son over to him right this second." I did not even bother ending the call. I dropped the phone into my purse, grabbed my keys, and sprinted out the door. The drive to Oak Ridge Elementary was a blur of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated fury. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. My father had crossed every conceivable line. Stealing my inheritance was a massive financial crime. Coming after my son was a declaration of war. I practically abandoned my car in the loading zone, the tires screeching against the pavement as I slammed the gear shift into park. I ran up the concrete steps and pushed through the heavy glass double doors of the main office. The scene inside the reception area made my blood boil. William was looming over the low wooden counter, his large frame intentionally invading the personal space of Mrs. Higgins. His face was a dark mottled red, and the veins in his thick neck were pulsing. "I am a prominent member of this community," William bellowed, slamming his fist against the laminated desk. "You will release my grandson into my custody right this second, or I will have my legal team bankrupt this school district by the end of the business day. The boy's mother is currently undergoing a severe psychiatric episode. It is a family emergency. Bring him out here now. Step away from that desk, William." My voice sliced through the administration office like a steel blade. Mrs. Higgins gasped in relief, clutching her desk phone like a lifeline. William spun around, his expensive cashmere overcoat flaring out around his knees. For a fraction of a second, surprise flashed across his face. He clearly had not expected me to arrive so quickly. He had severely underestimated a mother's speed when her child was threatened. But true to his toxic nature, the surprise instantly morphed into aggressive, calculated intimidation. He closed the distance between us, using his height to try and force me to look up at him submissively. "You have completely lost your mind, Melanie," he hissed, his voice dropping to a low, venomous octave intended only for my ears. "You are going to march back to your apartment, log into that remote server, and completely retract whatever fabricated audit report you submitted against your brother. Then you are going to call the bank and co-sign the collateral release. If you do not comply right now, I am taking the boy." I stood my ground. I did not retreat a single inch. "You are not taking my son anywhere. You do not have authorization and you do not have any power here." William let out a dark, condescending chuckle. "Power is exactly what I have, Melanie. I have money, I have influence, and I have the best family law attorneys in the state of Illinois on speed dial. You drop this audit or I will file for immediate grandparents' rights. I will drag you into family court and prove to a judge that you are an unfit, negligent mother. I will expose your long hours, your tiny apartment, and your supposed mental instability. I will take Leo away from you legally, and you will never see him again." He smiled, a cold, reptilian curving of his lips. "You are a single mother with zero resources. I am a millionaire patriarch. Who do you think the courts will believe 10 years ago? That threat would have shattered my resolve. I would have folded immediately, terrified of his wealth and his ruthless legal connections. But I was no longer the frightened girl who desperately craved his approval. I was the woman who had just uncovered his federal crimes. I reached into my leather tote bag. I did not pull out a tissue. I did not pull out a surrender flag. I pulled out my smartphone. The principal, Mr. Davis, had just emerged from the back office looking incredibly tense as he assessed the standoff in his lobby. I held up my hand, signaling him to wait. "You think you can build a custody case on a foundation of lies?" I said, keeping my eyes locked onto my father's furious face. "But you forget how careless you and Mom are when you think nobody of consequence is listening." I tapped the screen of my phone, opened my encrypted audio files, and hit play. I turned the volume all the way up. The pristine digital recording of our dinner at the steakhouse filled the quiet school office. The audio was crystal clear. My mother's sharp voice echoed, first complaining about Leo's presence, calling him a burden and an annoying distraction. Then William's deep, dismissive rumble played out loud for the school staff to hear. "The boy is a nuisance. He is just another financial drain she expects us to tolerate. Keep him away from Brandon. He has absolutely no place in our real family dynamic." William's face drained of color. The smug, arrogant smile completely vanished from his lips, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He looked around the lobby. Mrs. Higgins and Mr. Davis were staring at him with undisguised disgust. "That is an illegal recording," William sputtered, his voice suddenly lacking its booming authority. "It is a public restaurant in a one-party consent state." I corrected him sharply, slipping the phone back into my bag. But I did not come here just to play audio clips. I reached into my bag a second time and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. I handed it directly to Mr. Davis. "That is a formal, notarized draft for a temporary restraining order, along with a complete revocation of any and all emergency pickup permissions for William and Catherine," I announced clearly. "I have already sent a digital copy to my attorney, who is filing it with the county courthouse as we speak. If this man ever steps foot on school property again or comes within 500 feet of my son, you are to call the police immediately and have him arrested for trespassing and harassment." Mr. Davis took the envelope, his expression hardening. "Understood, Miss Wilson. Sir, I am going to have to ask you to leave the premises right now, or I will initiate a lockdown and contact the authorities myself." William realized he was entirely cornered. His leverage was gone. His intimidation tactics had failed spectacularly in front of an audience. He took a step back toward the glass doors, his hands balling into tight, shaking fists at his sides. The veins in his forehead were pulsing with toxic, impotent rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are dead to us!" William snarled, all pretense of corporate dignity completely gone. "You think you have won because you locked me out of an elementary school. Jasmine's charity gala is this Saturday. The entire city's financial elite will be there. The mayor, the bank executives, the press. We are going to take the stage and publicly announce your severe mental instability to the press. We will spin this entire audit as the delusions of a sick, jealous woman. We will destroy your professional reputation so thoroughly you will never work in accounting again." With that final venomous threat, William turned and shoved his way out of the glass doors, disappearing into the cold afternoon. I stood perfectly still, my heart pounding a steady, victorious rhythm against my ribs. Let them hold their gala. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. Across town, completely oblivious to the federal raid that had just decimated her husband's career, Jasmine was in her absolute element. The grand ballroom of the Sapphire Hotel was a flurry of chaotic activity, and Jasmine stood at the epicenter dictating orders with the haughty authority of a queen. She was orchestrating the annual Springtide Charity Gala, the crown jewel of the city's high society social calendar. For Jasmine, this event was not about philanthropy. It was about cementing her status among the financial elite. She paced across the imported marble floor, her designer heels clicking sharply as she berated a terrified florist for using the wrong shade of white orchids. In Jasmine's meticulously curated delusional world, Brandon was untouchable. He had told her that morning that he was dealing with a minor internal compliance dispute, a pathetic attempt by his jealous sister to cause trouble at the firm. Brandon had assured her it would be resolved by the weekend, framing Melanie's audit as nothing more than a desperate plea for attention. Jasmine believed every single word. She thrived on the narrative that Melanie was the tragic, unstable outcast of the family, forever envious of Brandon's success and Jasmine's perfect life. The idea that her husband was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, stripped of his assets and his dignity, had not even crossed her mind. Her biggest concern was whether the champagne tower would be structurally sound. While Jasmine obsessed over crystal centerpieces, I was sitting at my secure workstation, finalizing the digital evidence packages for the federal authorities. The schoolyard confrontation with William had cemented my resolve. There was no going back, and there was absolutely no room for hesitation. The doorbell of my apartment chimed, pulling my focus away from the glowing screen of my monitor. I walked to the front door and peered through the peephole to see a uniformed courier standing in the hallway holding a sleek black delivery box tied with a silver ribbon. I signed for the package, carrying it back to my desk with a sense of mild curiosity. The return address simply read, "From the desk of Jasmine." I pulled the ribbon loose and lifted the lid. There was no expensive gift inside. Instead, my fingers brushed against cheap, scratchy polyester. I pulled the garment out of the box, holding it up to the light. It was a catering uniform, a generic, ill-fitting black dress with a stiff white apron attached to the front. It looked like it belonged in a low-budget costume shop. A thick, cream-colored cardstock envelope rested at the bottom of the box. I opened it and pulled out a handwritten note. The elegant calligraphy was unmistakably Jasmine's. "Melanie, since you are so entirely obsessed with ruining my husband and inserting yourself into our affairs, I figured you might want to attend the gala this Saturday. However, we cannot have you embarrassing the family in front of our actual peers. You can come as part of the catering staff. Wear this, serve the champagne, know your place." I stared at the note, reading the vicious, petty words a second time. A year ago, this blatant insult would have crushed me. It would have sent me spiraling into a deep depression, reinforcing every terrible thing my family had ever conditioned me to believe about myself. I would have cried, thrown the box in the closet, and spent the weekend hiding in my apartment. Today, I felt absolutely nothing but cold, sharp amusement. Jasmine was playing high school mean girl games while I was dismantling a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement ring. The disconnect between her arrogant delusion and the catastrophic reality about to crush her was staggering. I did not cry. I did not scream. I calmly balled up the expensive cardstock, tossed it into the trash can, and dropped the cheap polyester uniform right on top of it. I picked up my smartphone and dialed a number I had not called in years, not since my early days climbing the corporate ladder before my family convinced me I was unworthy of luxury. The line rang twice before a crisp professional voice answered. "Marcus speaking. How can I help you?" "Marcus, it is Melanie," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "I need a massive favor. I am attending the Springtide Gala this Saturday evening, and I need a custom designer gown. Something architectural, powerful, and absolutely breathtaking. I need to command the entire room the second I walk through the doors. Price is entirely irrelevant." Marcus let out a delighted gasp. Melanie, it has been far too long. Consider it done. I have a stunning deep emerald silk piece that just arrived from Milan. It is fierce, it is elegant, and it takes absolutely no prisoners. I will have my tailoring team at your apartment tomorrow morning for the fitting. Perfect, I replied. Make sure the silhouette is flawless. I ended the call feeling a surge of adrenaline pulse through my veins. I was going to attend Jasmine's precious gala. I was going to walk into that ballroom, not as a broken outcast, but as the woman who held the match that would burn their fraudulent empire to ashes. William wanted to use the event to announce my supposed mental instability. He was going to find out exactly how stable and lethal I truly was. I turned my attention back to my computer, cracking my knuckles as I prepared to finalize the audit. I needed to ensure every single dollar Brandon had stolen was traced, categorized, and irrevocably linked to his offshore accounts. I opened the federal dossier I had compiled, scrolling through the list of shell companies Brandon and William had utilized to launder the stolen funds. My eyes scanned the primary entity, the Jasmine Foundation. I had already proven my father signed away my inheritance to fund its creation. But something about the timing of the gala suddenly nagged at the back of my mind. Jasmine was obsessed with her social standing, but she was also incredibly lazy. She rarely put genuine effort into anything unless it directly benefited her lifestyle. Organizing a massive charity event required immense dedication. Why was she so heavily invested in this specific gala? I opened a new tab on my secure browser and navigated to the official website for the Springtide Charity Gala. The home page was plastered with photos of Jasmine smiling benevolently, wearing expensive jewelry, while posing with local politicians. I bypassed the superficial marketing material and scrolled directly to the bottom of the page, searching for the legal disclosures and tax identification numbers required for all registered charity events. I found the tiny gray text listing the primary beneficiary of the evening's fundraising efforts. I highlighted the registered corporate name and cross-referenced it with the federal database open on my other monitor. My breath caught in my throat. The cursor blinked steadily on the screen, illuminating a truth so brazen and sickening it defied logic. The Springtide Charity Gala was not raising money for local schools or medical research. The entire event, funded by the city's wealthiest elites, was funneling donations directly into the Jasmine Foundation. Brandon had not merely named a shell company after his wife to flatter her ego. The gala itself was the ultimate money laundering mechanism. Jasmine was utilizing her high society connections to solicit millions of dollars in charitable donations, completely unaware that those funds were pouring straight into the exact fraudulent entity Brandon used to hide his stolen corporate assets. She was hosting a massive, highly publicized crime scene, and she was going to broadcast it live to the press. The grand ballroom of the Sapphire Hotel was a blinding spectacle of Chicago's financial and political elite. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars cast a fractured prismatic light across the imported marble floors. A 12-piece string quartet played in the corner, their music completely drowned out by the deafening roar of high society networking, the sharp clinking of champagne flutes, and the relentless blinding flash of paparazzi cameras cordoned off near the velvet ropes. Jasmine stood at the exact center of the room, holding court like a monarch inspecting her subjects. She was draped in a silver sequined gown that caught every flash of light, but it was the necklace that demanded absolute submission. It was a custom platinum piece dripping with over $500,000 in flawless teardrop diamonds. She touched her collarbone constantly, ensuring every photographer and bank executive's wife had an unobstructed view of her wealth. She was entirely oblivious to the federal raid that had dismantled her husband's office just days prior. To the guests inquiring about Brandon's noticeable absence, she offered a perfectly practiced dismissive sigh. She claimed he was detained on a highly confidential international conference call, finalizing a merger too complex for public consumption. She spun the narrative, effortlessly fully convinced that Brandon's legal troubles were nothing more than a minor annoyance orchestrated by a jealous, estranged sister. She believed her carefully constructed reality was bulletproof. Tonight was her triumph, the ultimate validation of her status. Outside, a sleek black town car glided to a halt at the edge of the red carpet. The valet scrambled to open the heavy door. I stepped out into the crisp Chicago night, placing one stiletto onto the pavement. Marcus had outdone himself. The custom emerald silk gown was not just a piece of clothing, it was architectural warfare. It draped across my shoulders and plunged down my back in sharp, uncompromising lines that commanded absolute authority. The deep, rich green of the fabric moved like liquid glass, highlighting a posture I had spent 33 years hiding. I wore no diamonds. I wore no flashy accessories. I did not need them. My weapon was the undeniable truth locked safely in the digital vault of my phone and the devastating financial power I now wielded. I walked past the velvet ropes and through the towering gold-leaf doors of the ballroom. The transformation of the room was instantaneous. The loud, chaotic hum of the gala faltered. It started near the entrance as guests turned to see who commanded such a striking presence, and the silence rippled outward like a wave. Heads turned. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The paparazzi, sensing a shift in the gravitational pull of the room, abandoned the minor celebrities and turned their lenses toward the entrance. Flashbulbs erupted in a blinding staccato rhythm, capturing my slow, deliberate descent down the grand staircase. I felt the collective gaze of Chicago's elite washing over me. Years ago, this kind of scrutiny would have sent me running for the nearest exit, consumed by the crushing belief that I did not belong. Tonight, I met their stares with a cold, unwavering calm. I belonged exactly where I stood. Jasmine was mid-laugh, holding a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon, when she noticed the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. She turned her head, her heavy diamond necklace catching the light, and her eyes locked onto mine. The color drained instantly from her heavily contoured face. For a fraction of a second, her brain simply could not process the image in front of her. She expected me to be cowering in a cheap polyester maid's uniform, serving hors d'oeuvres and keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the floor. She expected a broken, humiliated outcast. Instead, she saw a predator stepping onto her carefully manicured hunting ground. The shock quickly morphed into an ugly, visceral rage. Her manicured fingers gripped the stem of her champagne flute so tightly the crystal threatened to shatter. She slammed the glass down onto a passing waiter's silver tray, spilling the expensive liquid across his pristine white gloves, and marched aggressively across the marble floor. She abandoned a state senator mid-conversation, her eyes blazing with furious indignation. "What do you think you are doing here?" Jasmine hissed, stopping inches from my face. Her voice was a low, venomous whisper, desperate to keep the surrounding guests from hearing the crack in her perfect facade. I smiled, a slow, predatory curving of my lips. "I am attending a charity gala, Jasmine. I believe that is the customary purpose of renting out the Sapphire Hotel." "You ungrateful, delusional rat!" she snarled, her chest heaving beneath the silver sequins. "I sent you a uniform. I told you exactly what your place was in this family. You are a mentally unstable, jealous failure who is actively trying to ruin my husband out of pure spite. You do not belong in this room. You do not belong in this social strata." She did not wait for my response. She spun around, her eyes frantically scanning the perimeter of the ballroom until she locked onto the towering figure of the event's head of security. He was a broad-shouldered man with a stern face and a coiled earpiece standing near the main exit. "Security!" Jasmine snapped her fingers loudly, dropping all pretense of high society etiquette. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, her voice rising to a shrill, commanding pitch that echoed across the quieted room. "Remove this woman immediately. She crashed my event. She has absolutely no authorization to be in this building." The head of security moved swiftly, cutting through the crowd of stunned guests with practiced efficiency. He stepped between Jasmine and me, his posture rigid and professional. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" he asked, looking down at Jasmine. "Yes, there is a massive problem," Jasmine shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of ugly entitlement. "This woman is a trespasser. She is disturbed and she is harassing my guests. I want her physically escorted off the premises right this second, or I will ensure you are fired before midnight." The security chief turned his attention to me. His expression was carefully neutral, assessing the situation. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a digital tablet, bringing up the master guest registry and the secure VIP manifests. "May I have your name, please?" he asked politely. "Melanie Wilson," I replied, my voice steady, clear, and perfectly audible to the dozens of elite guests eagerly eavesdropping on the confrontation. Jasmine crossed her arms, a smug, victorious sneer stretching across her face. "Check the caterer list. Check the band list. Just get her out of my sight." The head of security tapped the screen of his tablet. His eyes scanned the digital text, and then he froze. He blinked, reading the specific entry a second time. The rigid, authoritative tension in his shoulders completely vanished. He slowly lowered the tablet, his expression shifting from professional detachment to absolute, undeniable respect. He did not reach for my arm. He did not ask me to step toward the exit. Instead, he took a deliberate step backward and bowed his head slightly in my direction. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We cannot remove the event's platinum sponsor." The heavy oak doors of the ballroom closed behind me, shutting out Jasmine's sputtering rage. The head of security had completely neutralized her power with a single sentence, leaving her standing on the imported marble floor, looking like a child who had just been denied a toy. I did not look back. I adjusted the drape of my emerald silk gown, took a flute of vintage champagne from a passing waiter, and walked directly into the heart of the cocktail hour. The room was a sea of tailored tuxedos and glittering diamonds. Conversations paused as I walked past, replaced by frantic, hushed whispers. The elite of Chicago knew something was shifting. They could smell the blood in the water. Before I could even reach the center ice sculpture, a hand clamped down hard on my upper arm. The grip was frantic, bruising, and entirely familiar. I turned my head slowly, my expression completely neutral, and looked down at the fingers digging into my silk sleeve. Brandon immediately let go, trying to mask his panic with a tight, artificial smile for the surrounding guests. My golden child brother looked horrendous. The tailored lines of his tuxedo could not hide the fact that he had spent the last 48 hours in a federal holding cell. His skin was pale and clammy, his eyes were bloodshot, and a thick sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He was fresh off a massive bail bond secured entirely by our parents' heavily leveraged real estate, and the sheer terror of his impending federal indictment was radiating off him like heat from a furnace. "We need to talk," Brandon hissed through gritted teeth, keeping his fake smile plastered on his face as a photographer snapped a picture nearby. "Right now." He did not wait for my response. He positioned his body to block my path and aggressively steered me away from the crowded dance floor, pushing me through a set of heavy velvet curtains that concealed a private VIP alcove. The heavy fabric swung shut instantly, muffling the string quartet and the clinking of crystal glasses. The small, dimly lit space was designed for private corporate negotiations, not family warfare. Brandon dropped the polite facade the absolute second the curtains closed. He lunged forward, invading my personal space, his chest heaving. "Did you honestly think you could just walk in here and ruin my life?" Brandon demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and entitlement. "Do you have any idea what the last 2 days have been like for me?" The FBI seized my hard drives. They froze my personal accounts. I had to sit in an interrogation room while federal agents asked me about offshore wire transfers. "You stole $3 million, Brandon," I replied, taking a slow, calm sip of my champagne. "Federal interrogation is the standard consequence for corporate embezzlement. You should consider yourself lucky they allowed you to post bail to attend your wife's fraudulent charity event." He sneered, a desperate, cornered animal trying to bare its teeth. "You think you are so brilliant, Melanie. You think you hold all the cards because you ran a little audit. But you forgot who you are dealing with. I have always been one step ahead of you." He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a sharply folded piece of printer paper. He thrust it into my face, his hand trembling slightly. "Read it," he commanded. I did not take the paper. I simply lowered my gaze and read the text illuminated by the dim ambient light of the alcove. It was a printout of an email formatted to look exactly like the internal communication system of Sterling Trust. The sender address was my old, deactivated corporate email from 5 years ago. The recipient was Brandon. The body of the text contained explicit, detailed instructions authorizing the transfer of $3 million into the Jasmine Foundation. It painted me as the sole architect of the entire embezzlement scheme, directing Brandon to execute the transfers on my behalf. I hacked your old email account, Brandon stated, his voice dripping with a toxic, triumphant malice. I reactivated it through the legacy server, bypassed the two-factor authentication, and sent this directly to my current inbox. It has your digital signature. It has your specific formatting. If you do not withdraw your audit by Monday morning and claim it was a catastrophic system error, I am handing this printout over to my defense attorney. He stepped closer, towering over me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me exactly the way our father always did. If I go down, you go down with me as my accomplice. You will lose your son. You will lose your career. You will go to federal prison. Drop the audit. Melanie and I will destroy this document tonight. We can both walk away. I stared at the piece of paper. I looked at Brandon's desperate, sweating face. And then I did the only thing a sane person could do in that exact moment. I laughed. It was not a polite, suppressed chuckle. It was a loud, genuine, echoing laugh that bounced off the walls of the velvet alcove. Brandon flinched completely, thrown off balance by my reaction. What is so funny, he snapped, his false confidence cracking instantly. You really aren't smart, Brandon, I said, shaking my head in pure, unfiltered amusement. You have spent your entire life paying other people to take your exams, begging Dad to bribe your professors, and stealing credit for work you never did. You genuinely believe that forging a document is as simple as typing words onto a screen. I took another slow sip of champagne, savoring the absolute destruction I was about to unleash on his fragile ego. Did you think hacking a legacy server meant you were invisible? I asked, my voice dropping to a precise, clinical tone. I have been a cybersecurity expert for a decade. I designed the exact legacy server protocol you think you bypassed. When you reactivated that dormant email address, you triggered a silent Tier 1 security alert directly to my personal administrative dashboard. Brandon swallowed hard, the color draining from his face entirely. But it gets so much better, I continued, stepping forward and forcing him to back up against the velvet wall. You faked an email implicating me in a federal crime, but you generated it from an IP address registered to your own home network. The metadata embedded in that digital file proves that the email was written, sent, and received from the Wi-Fi router sitting in your living room exactly 4 hours ago. You did not just forge a document, Brandon. You literally generated a digital footprint, proving you tampered with evidence and committed federal wire fraud while currently out on bail. The piece of paper slipped from Brandon's fingers, fluttering uselessly to the carpeted floor. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the small room as the inescapable reality of his stupidity crashed down on him. I had checkmated him flawlessly. Before I could deliver the final crushing blow, the heavy velvet curtains at the entrance of the alcove were violently ripped apart. The harsh light of the ballroom flooded the small space. Catherine and William walked into the alcove, their faces set in twin masks of cold, calculated fury. They did not look at Brandon, who was currently leaning against the wall, gasping for air. They flanked him perfectly, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of parental authority. The toxic family unit was completely assembled. My father adjusted his expensive silk tie, his eyes locked onto mine with a chilling, deadened lack of emotion. He had realized his money and his status could not save his son from the digital evidence I possessed. He was completely out of legitimate options. "We will testify against you," Melanie Williams said coldly, his voice devoid of any parental affection. "We will go to the federal prosecutors on Monday morning. We will sit on the witness stand under oath, and we will swear to a judge that you orchestrated the whole thing. You would perjure yourselves in federal court to protect him." I did not phrase it as a question. I simply let the sheer weight of William's threat settle into the quiet, dimly lit space of the alcove. I stared at the man who had contributed half of my DNA, realizing with absolute clarity that there was not a single shred of genuine humanity left inside him. He was not a father. He was a cornered asset manager trying to protect his most prized depreciating investment, and he was perfectly willing to throw his daughter directly under the bus to do it. Catherine stepped forward, placing a perfectly manicured hand on William's arm to gently push him back. She was wearing a blush pink silk gown, that matched Jasmine's aesthetic, playing the role of the elegant, pacifying matriarch. She looked at me with a soft, pleading expression that was so deeply practiced it made my stomach turn. She was shifting tactics, abandoning William's brute force for psychological warfare. "Melanie, darling, let us just take a breath and be reasonable about this," Catherine began. Her voice dropped into a soothing maternal cadence that she had not used on me since I was a child. "Nobody wants to see this family torn apart. Nobody wants to go to court. But we have to look at the reality of the situation. Brandon has a massive career. He has a public profile, a wife, a reputation that the entire financial sector relies on. And I am just disposable," I offered my voice entirely flat. "You are resilient," Catherine corrected smoothly, stepping closer as if she were about to embrace me. "You always have been the tough one. You are a woman, Melanie. The justice system is entirely different from others. The judge will look at you, see a single mother who made a desperate financial mistake, and they will go easy on you. You will get probation, maybe a few months in a minimum security facility at absolute worst. Brandon would be ruined forever. He would not survive a federal penitentiary." Brandon whimpered in the corner, nodding vigorously at our mother's insane, twisted logic. He genuinely believed I should sacrifice my freedom so he could continue drinking vintage champagne and wearing bespoke tuxedos. Catherine reached into her beaded clutch, pulling out a tissue to dab at her perfectly dry eyes. "We will make it worth your while, Melanie. I know how much you struggle in that tiny apartment. We can finally send Leo to that elite boarding school you always wanted for him, the Sterling Academy. We will pay the tuition in full. We will make sure his entire future is financially secure while you deal with the legal fallout. Just take the blame for your brother. You are a woman, the judge will go easy on you. Do this one selfless thing for your family, and you will never have to worry about money again." The alcove went dead silent. Even the muffled music from the ballroom seemed to fade away entirely. I looked at Catherine, then at William, and finally at Brandon, who was practically holding his breath in desperate anticipation. I felt a physical wave of absolute disgust wash over me. It was a revulsion so pure and intense it tasted metallic on my tongue. The lengths they would go to protect their golden child defied all logic and morality. They were actively, willingly attempting to bribe their own daughter into taking the fall for a multi-million-dollar federal crime, completely indifferent to the fact that it would tear a mother away from her young son. They were treating my life, my freedom, and my child as expendable poker chips to cover Brandon's massive, pathetic debts. I looked right into Catherine's eyes, dropping the polite, detached smile I had worn all evening. "Leo has been enrolled in Sterling Academy for 2 years, Mom," I said. My voice sliced through her toxic manipulation like a scalpel. Catherine blinked her hand, freezing halfway to her face with the tissue. "What? I pay the $40,000 tuition in cash every single semester." I continued, taking a slow step forward and forcing her to retreat. "I bought my own apartment in cash. I have a 7-figure investment portfolio. I built a massive, thriving career in forensic accounting and cybersecurity, while you three were busy pretending I was a helpless, struggling outcast. You would know exactly where your grandson went to school, and you would know exactly how successful I am if you had ever once bothered to ask about him. But you didn't. You never checked on us because you were too busy funding Brandon's catastrophic failures." William's face turned a mottled, dangerous shade of purple. "You insolent, lying ingrate! Do not speak to me!" I commanded, my voice echoing off the velvet walls with an authority that physically stopped him in his tracks. "You have no power here. Your money is gone, William. Brandon's accounts have been seized. The collateral you co-signed for his bail is tied to offshore accounts the FBI has already frozen. You are bankrupt. You are all completely, utterly bankrupt." Brandon let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, sliding down the wall until he hit the floor, burying his face in his hands. "You think you can just orchestrate this and walk away?" William snarled, his fists balling at his sides, though he did not dare step closer to me. "You think you can destroy us and just go back to your little life? I will drag your name through the mud until you cannot find work in this entire state." You are not going to have time to worry about my reputation, I replied calmly, checking the face of my watch. The timing was absolutely perfect. Beyond the heavy velvet curtains, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted violently. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note, the abrupt silence punctuated by the screech of a cello bow against strings. A low, panicked murmur swept through the crowd of hundreds of guests, growing rapidly into a wave of alarmed, frantic voices. I pulled the curtain back just enough to reveal the main entrance of the ballroom. The massive, gold-leafed double doors had been shoved open. Standing at the threshold, silhouetted by the flashing lights of the paparazzi in the hallway, was Jonathan Hayes, the CEO of the parent corporation Brandon had spent the last 3 years defrauding. He did not look happy. He looked like an executioner. Flanking Jonathan was a team of severe-looking men and women in dark, tailored suits. They wore identical, grim expressions and carried thick, leather-bound folders. Several of them had silver federal badges clipped to their belts. They moved into the room with military precision, ignoring the outraged gasps of the city's social elite. Jasmine was standing near the champagne tower, her jaw hanging open in sheer horror as she tried to intercept them. The federal agents bypassed her completely physically, brushing past her expensive silver gown, their eyes methodically scanning the room. They were looking for the guest of honor. They were looking for Brandon. I let the velvet curtain fall shut, turning back to my family one last time. The color had completely vanished from Catherine's face. William was staring at the curtain as if it were a ticking bomb. Brandon was sobbing openly on the floor, his hands gripping his hair in absolute terror. I smoothed the fabric of my emerald gown, picked up my clutch, and offered them one final victorious smile. Enjoy the party, it is your last. I walked out of the VIP alcove, leaving my parents and Brandon choking on the toxic fumes of their own collapsing empire. The atmosphere in the grand ballroom had shifted from elegant celebration to a tense, suffocating lockdown. The federal agents had fanned out across the perimeter with quiet, ruthless efficiency. They stood shoulder to shoulder with the hotel security staff, blocking the heavy gold-leafed exit doors. Jonathan Hayes, the CEO of the corporation. My brother had spent 3 years bleeding dry, stood near the main entrance. He caught my gaze across the sea of tailored tuxedos and gave me a single grim nod. The trap was entirely sealed. Nobody was leaving this room. I navigated through the whispering crowd to find my assigned seat. Jasmine had truly outdone herself in the petty revenge department. My place card was resting on a tiny, wobbly table, crammed directly against the swinging wooden doors of the hotel kitchen. Every few seconds, a frantic waiter would rush past the heavy doors, nearly clipping the back of my chair as they hauled trays of empty champagne flutes and dirty appetizer plates. The smell of roasted duck mixed heavily with the scent of industrial dish soap. It was the ultimate social exile, a calculated seating arrangement designed to isolate and humiliate me in front of the city's financial elite. I took my seat without a single complaint. I smoothed the rich emerald silk of my custom designer gown over my knees, perfectly content to watch the impending explosion from the back row. Across the room, I saw Brandon stumble out from behind the velvet curtains of the alcove. He looked like a walking corpse. His skin was gray, his hair was plastered to his forehead with nervous sweat, and his tuxedo jacket looked suddenly 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. He practically collapsed into his chair at the primary VIP table situated directly in front of the main stage. He gripped a fresh glass of bourbon with violently shaking hands, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of control, while federal agents literally surrounded the room. Jasmine, meanwhile, remained entirely oblivious to the federal lockdown. She glided onto the main stage, her heavy diamond necklace catching the glare of the overhead lights. She tapped the microphone, a bright artificial smile plastered across her face. The room quieted down, though a tense electric undercurrent buzzed through the guests who had noticed the men in dark suits securing the exits. Jasmine completely misread the room. She assumed the hushed, nervous whispers were a silent tribute to her grandeur and absolute authority. She began her speech, her voice oozing with practiced, sickeningly sweet philanthropy. She thanked the wealthy donors. She praised the local politicians sitting in the front row, and she highlighted her own supposedly tireless efforts to organize the Springtide Charity Gala. She spoke at length about the importance of family legacy and giving back to the less fortunate. Then her eyes locked directly onto my table by the kitchen doors. Jasmine signaled the lighting technician with a subtle flick of her wrist. A harsh, blinding white spotlight swung violently across the massive ballroom, cutting through the dim, romantic ambiance and pinning me directly in its glare. "Tonight is about family and philanthropy," Jasmine announced, her voice echoing through the massive speakers and bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. "And I want to give a special thanks to my troubled sister-in-law, Melanie, who is sitting right over there by the kitchen." She paused, letting the cruel geography of my seating assignment sink into the minds of the audience. "Melanie has had a very difficult, unstable year." Jasmine continued, her tone dripping with condescending venom. "But she is finally trying to learn how high society works. We are just so proud she could join us tonight in her own little way. Let us all give her a warm, encouraging round of applause." A wave of awkward, polite applause rippled through the ballroom. Hundreds of guests turned in their seats to stare at me. Their faces were a mixture of pity, confusion, and second-hand embarrassment. From his seat at the VIP table, Brandon forced a weak, arrogant smirk. He raised his bourbon glass in my direction, desperately clinging to his wife's pathetic attempt to humiliate me. He genuinely believed that if they embarrassed me enough in front of these people, I would shrink back into the shadows and cancel the federal audit. I did not shrink away. I did not avert my eyes. I did not hide my face in shame. I stood up. I stood up slowly, the movement deliberate and utterly, completely devoid of hesitation. The harsh white spotlight caught the deep, rich emerald silk of my $10,000 custom gown, illuminating the fierce architectural silhouette. The dress commanded absolute authority, completely shattering the illusion of the tragic poor sister-in-law Jasmine was trying to project. The sheer power of my presence combined with my absolute lack of embarrassment caused the scattered applause to die instantly. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. I stepped away from the kitchen doors and began walking down the center aisle, moving straight toward the stage. My stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the imported marble floor. The crowd parted instinctively, pulling their chairs in to give me a wide, unobstructed path. About halfway down the aisle, an audio-visual technician was standing near the edge of the tables, holding a spare wireless microphone. I did not stop walking. I did not ask for permission. I simply reached out and took the microphone directly from his hands. He stepped back, too stunned by my momentum to utter a single word of protest. Jasmine's smug smile vanished. As I closed the distance to the stage, the reality of my appearance finally registered in her brain. She looked at my gown, she looked at the microphone in my hand, and her face contorted into a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. She took a frantic step backward, her hands gripping the edges of the acrylic podium as if it could protect her. Brandon's smirk evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer terror. I reached the base of the stage and stopped. I switched the microphone on. I held the gaze of every single billionaire politician and federal agent in the room, letting the heavy silence stretch for one more agonizing second. "Thank you, Jasmine." My voice echoed through the ballroom, crystal clear and lethally calm. "But I think it is time high society learns exactly how your charity works." The sound of my voice vibrating through the ballroom speakers finally broke the spell of shock that had paralyzed the room. Brandon snapped. The sheer terror of public exposure short-circuited whatever remaining self-preservation instincts he possessed. He leaped up from the VIP table, his chair crashing backward onto the marble floor. Crystal champagne flutes shattered as his knee clipped the edge of the table. "Shut her up!" Brandon screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as he lunged toward the center aisle. "Turn off that microphone. Do not let her speak." He sprinted toward the stage, his eyes wide and wild, desperately intent on physically tearing the microphone from my hands. He did not even make it 3 steps. Before his foot could touch the bottom stair, 2 massive men in dark suits stepped seamlessly into his path. These were not the hotel's standard event bouncers. These were the elite private security contractors Jonathan Hayes employed to protect his corporate assets. The guard on the left planted his hand squarely in the center of Brandon's chest, delivering a sudden, brutal shove that stopped my brother's momentum instantly. Brandon gasped for air, stumbling backward. Before he could recover, the second guard gripped him by the shoulders and forced him forcefully back down into his overturned chair, pinning him in place. Jonathan Hayes stepped forward from the shadows, adjusting his platinum cufflinks. He looked down at Brandon with an expression of absolute freezing disdain. "You are going to sit there quietly, Brandon," Jonathan commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying enough authority to make the surrounding guests flinch. "You are going to sit there and you are going to listen to exactly what your sister has to say." I did not wait for Brandon's response. I turned my attention away from the pathetic scuffle and looked out over the sea of wealthy donors, politicians, and socialites. Then I raised my free hand and gave a subtle, practiced nod toward the tinted glass of the audio-visual booth hovering at the back of the mezzanine. I had not come to this gala unequipped. When I bypassed Brandon's ridiculous security protocols earlier this evening, I did more than just isolate his digital footprint. I took remote administrative control of the hotel's presentation servers. Instantly, the massive wall-to-wall LED screens positioned behind Jasmine flickered. The carefully curated montage of smiling, underprivileged children in pristine classrooms vanished into blackness. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom as the screens flared back to life. In place of the heartwarming charity propaganda, a high-resolution, brutally clear forensic financial flowchart illuminated the room in stark white and red. It was a spider web of offshore wire transfers, dummy shell companies, and heavily redacted banking statements. At the very center of the web was the Sterling Trust corporate logo, with thick, undeniable red lines connecting it directly to the Jasmine Foundation's primary operating accounts. "Tonight we are supposedly raising money for underprivileged youth," I announced, my voice slicing through the heavy, stunned silence of the room. "We are supposedly here to fund community centers, educational scholarships, and after-school programs. You have all written massive checks, believing your generosity was changing lives." I began to pace slowly across the stage, letting the sheer weight of the digital evidence loom over the crowd behind me. Yet a forensic audit of this charity's accounts shows a very different story. I continued, my tone sharp and clinical. Over the past 36 months, exactly $3 million has been systematically drained from Sterling Trust and funneled directly into this supposedly nonprofit foundation. But that money never reached a single classroom. Instead, these documents show the funds flowing immediately out of the charity and directly into Brandon's offshore gambling accounts in Macau and the Cayman Islands. The murmurs in the crowd morphed into loud, outraged exclamations. I could see prominent hedge fund managers pulling out their phones, frantically texting their legal teams. Politicians who had been photographed shaking hands with Brandon earlier in the evening were now physically inching their chairs away from the VIP table, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. "But my brother did not act alone in spending your donations," I added, turning my gaze directly toward Jasmine, who was still frozen behind the acrylic podium. "The gambling debts only account for half of the stolen funds. The rest of the $3 million was carefully routed through a series of shell companies and deposited directly into the private accounts of boutique jewelers in Paris, Milan, and Geneva." I pointed directly at the glittering, heavy diamond necklace resting against Jasmine's collarbone. "Every single piece of haute couture, every imported sports car, and every custom diamond collection my sister-in-law has paraded around the city for the last 3 years was purchased using stolen corporate funds laundered through a fake charity. You are not looking at philanthropists, you are looking at federal criminals who used your good intentions to fund a lavish, fraudulent lifestyle." The ballroom erupted. The polite veneer of high society completely disintegrated into a chaotic chorus of shouting accusations and furious demands for refunds. I kept my eyes locked on Jasmine. The smug, arrogant superiority that had defined her entire existence was melting away in real time. She slowly turned her head, her neck stiff with terror, and looked up at the massive LED screens behind her. She stared at the bank statements. She saw the exact dates of the wire transfers lining up perfectly with her extravagant European shopping sprees. She saw her own signature digitally copied and authorized on the Foundation's transfer release forms. The blood drained from Jasmine's face so fast, I thought she might actually faint. Her skin turned a sickly translucent shade of white. Her hands gripped the edges of the podium so tightly her knuckles bruised. She looked down at Brandon, who was currently pinned to his chair by Jonathan's security team, weeping into his hands. The horrifying truth finally crashed down on her. Jasmine was vain, greedy, and relentlessly cruel, but she was not a financial mastermind. She genuinely believed her husband was simply a brilliant, highly successful executive who loved spoiling her. She had happily signed the foundation documents Brandon put in front of her, enjoying the social prestige of running a charity without ever looking at the ledger. She had not known Brandon was stealing the money, and she certainly had not realized he was using her foundation and her legally binding signature as the primary vehicle to launder $3 million. Brandon had not just stolen from his employer. He had set up his own wife to take the fall for federal wire fraud. Jasmine's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was completely, utterly trapped in a prison of her own making, staring down the barrel of a federal indictment for a crime her husband orchestrated behind her back. The cameras of the paparazzi stationed by the doors began to flash wildly, capturing the exact second the golden couple of Chicago society realized their lives were officially over. The deafening silence that followed my declaration shattered into a cacophony of outraged gasps and furious murmurs. Before Jasmine could even attempt to formulate a pathetic excuse, the heavy rhythmic sound of footsteps echoed up the wooden stairs of the stage. Jonathan Hayes ascended into the glaring white spotlight. The CEO of Sterling Trust did not look like a man attending a charity gala. He looked like an apex predator who had finally cornered his prey. Jonathan bypassed Jasmine entirely, ignoring her trembling, tear-streaked face. He walked directly to my side, turning his imposing frame to face the sea of panicked elites. From the floor, pinned firmly to his overturned chair by two massive security contractors, Brandon let out a desperate, guttural scream. "Jonathan, do not listen to her!" He shouted, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "She is lying. Melanie is a nobody. She is just my bitter, jealous sister who works out of a tiny apartment. She forged those documents to ruin me. I am your top executive. You know me." Jonathan looked down at my brother with an expression of absolute freezing disgust. He did not yell. He simply extended his hand toward me, and I passed him the wireless microphone. When Jonathan spoke, his deep, resonant voice instantly silenced the chaotic ballroom. "You are not a top executive, Brandon," Jonathan said, the clinical precision of his words cutting through the air like a knife. "You are an incompetent, reckless thief who spent 3 years hiding behind forged quarterly reports, and your father's rapidly deteriorating reputation. And you are right about one thing. The woman standing next to me did not belong at that table by the kitchen doors." Jonathan turned slightly, gesturing toward me with a look of profound, genuine respect. "For those of you who have been force-fed the lies of the Sterling family," Jonathan announced to the breathless crowd, "allow me to introduce you to the reality. Melanie is not a nobody. She is the founder and CEO of Apex Risk Management. She is widely considered the most brilliant, ruthless forensic auditor in the United States. When I suspected internal bleeding within my corporation, I did not call the federal authorities. I called her firm." A wave of shocked realization washed over the audience. Whispers spread like wildfire as hedge fund managers and bank presidents suddenly recognized the name of my fiercely private, highly elite firm. The narrative of the tragic, helpless sister was instantly dead. "Melanie spent the last 6 months systematically dismantling every single one of your pathetic firewalls, Brandon," Jonathan continued, leaning forward over the podium. "She traced every stolen cent. She mapped every offshore wire transfer. She built an impenetrable, legally bulletproof case against you, and she just saved my firm from a catastrophic multi-million-dollar embezzlement scandal. She holds more power in a single keystroke than you have held in your entire miserable life." The truth landed like a physical blow. Brandon stopped struggling against the security guards. His jaw dropped, his bloodshot eyes staring up at me in absolute horrified comprehension. The sister he had relentlessly mocked, the woman he had tried to frame for federal wire fraud, was the exact architect of his complete destruction. I had not just run a little audit, I owned the firm that caught him. The sheer gravity of the revelation finally snapped Jasmine out of her paralyzed state. The reality that she was staring down decades in federal prison for a charity she only used for social clout broke her mind entirely. Jasmine let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. She hiked up the skirt of her heavy silver designer gown, practically leaped off the edge of the stage, and sprinted directly toward her husband. The security guards tightened their grip on Brandon, but they did not step in to protect him from his wife. Jasmine slammed into Brandon, her manicured hands balling into fists as she began hammering them relentlessly against his chest. "You told me you earned that money!" Jasmine screamed, her voice shrill and echoing over the silent crowd. "You told me your bonuses paid for the house, the cars, the trips to Milan. You swore to me you were a financial genius." "Jasmine, stop please, the feds are right there!" Brandon whimpered desperately, trying to shield his face from her manicured claws while remaining pinned by the guards. "You made me the face of a criminal enterprise," she shrieked, grabbing the lapels of his bespoke tuxedo and violently shaking him. "My signature is on every single one of those foundation documents. I paraded around this city, wearing stolen diamonds. I hosted galas with stolen money. You set me up to take the fall for your pathetic, disgusting gambling debts. I am going to federal prison because you are a weak, stupid fraud." Jasmine ripped the heavy multi-million-dollar diamond necklace from her own throat. The clasp snapped, sending a shower of precious stones scattering across the imported marble floor. She threw the ruined piece of jewelry directly into Brandon's face before collapsing into a sobbing, hyperventilating heap on the ground beside him. The federal agents standing by the exits began pulling out their handcuffs, moving methodically toward the VIP table. The takedown was absolute. But the toxic delusion of my family knew no bounds. As the federal agents closed in on Brandon and Jasmine, the velvet curtains of the VIP alcove violently parted. Catherine stormed into the main ballroom. Her blush pink silk gown billowed around her like a storm cloud. She completely ignored the flashing cameras of the paparazzi, the federal badges, and the sheer horror of her high society peers. She shoved her way past a bewildered state senator, marched up the side stairs of the stage, and lunged directly at Jonathan. Before he could react, Catherine aggressively snatched the wireless microphone right out of his hand. She turned to face the crowd, her eyes blazing with an insane, desperate arrogance. She refused to accept that her reign over Chicago society had just ended. "It does not matter what she says!" Catherine screamed into the microphone, her voice echoing with shrill, unhinged fury over the murmuring crowd. "None of this matters. My son is innocent, and this is a targeted, jealous witch hunt orchestrated by a deeply disturbed woman." She pointed a trembling diamond-adorned finger directly at my face, her chest heaving with exertion. "We still have our family estate," Catherine shouted, entirely disconnected from the reality of the federal agents currently pulling her sobbing son to his feet and reading him his Miranda rights. "We will liquidate our assets, and we will sue every single one of you for defamation. We will sue Jonathan. We will sue Melanie. You think you can destroy the Sterling family over a few missing files? Our mansion alone is worth tens of millions of dollars. We will bury you all in court." Catherine stood on the stage, chest heaving, gripping the microphone as if it were a weapon. She waited for the murmurs of the crowd to shift into sympathetic agreement. She waited for the wealthy elite to rally behind the Sterling family name, just as they always had. Instead, she was met with a deafening, horrified silence. The billionaires, socialites, and politicians stared at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. Nobody was coming to her rescue. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic, unhinged energy. I simply stepped down from the stage, my heels clicking softly against the marble, and walked directly toward my mother. The distance between us felt like crossing a battlefield I had been fighting on for my entire life, but the war was already won. I stopped 2 feet away from her, completely invading her personal space, forcing her to look me in the eye. Catherine's grip on the microphone trembled. The blush pink silk of her gown suddenly looked ridiculous, a costume for a life she could no longer afford. I reached into my custom emerald designer clutch. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. The latch clicked open with a sharp metallic sound that seemed to echo in the quiet room. I pulled out a thick, heavy stack of meticulously folded legal documents, the premium paper bound by a heavy brass clip. I held the stack out to her. She stared at it, refusing to take it. I simply stepped closer and pressed the documents directly against her chest, forcing her to wrap her free hand around them or let them fall to the floor. Instinctively, she grabbed them. "You do not have a mansion, Mom," I said. My voice was quiet, stripped of any anger or malice, delivering the absolute clinical truth. Catherine stared at me, her eyes darting back and forth as if trying to decipher a foreign language. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, the microphone picking up the faint, breathless sound and broadcasting it to the entire room. I kept my gaze locked on hers. When Brandon drained the foundation accounts to pay his gambling debts in Macau, it was not enough. The syndicates he owed money to did not care about his last name or your social standing. They wanted their cash. So your golden child got creative. He used the power of attorney you and William so blindly granted him 5 years ago. He secretly took out a massive, heavily leveraged second mortgage on the family estate. He drained every drop of equity you had built over the last 4 decades to cover his catastrophic losses. Catherine's face turned the color of ash. She slowly turned her head to look at Brandon, who was currently pinned against a chair by federal agents, sobbing openly, unable to deny a single word I was saying. "He stopped paying that mortgage 6 months ago." I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. "The bank sent multiple default notices. Brandon intercepted the mail. He paid off your private accountant to hide the delinquency from you and William. By the time the bank finalized the paperwork, you were already living in a home you no longer owned. They foreclosed on the Sterling estate 3 weeks ago." "No," Catherine gasped, shaking her head in frantic, rapid movements. "No, that is impossible. William would have known. Our lawyers would have known." "Your lawyers work for the firm Brandon was embezzling from," I reminded her. "The very firm Jonathan Hayes controls. They dropped you as clients the second the federal subpoenas were issued. You have no representation, no equity, and no home." Catherine looked down at the thick stack of papers in her hands. The top page was a deed of transfer stamped with the official seal of the county clerk. "It went up for a quiet, private auction on Thursday," I said, delivering the final, absolute twist of the knife. "The bank wanted to offload the toxic asset quickly before Brandon's impending federal indictment tanked the property value, and my LLC bought it in cash." I stepped back, allowing the full weight of the revelation to crush her carefully constructed reality. "I am the legal owner of the estate," I announced. "I own the land. I own the house. I own the walls you spent my entire childhood painting to look perfect for your wealthy friends. Your possessions have already been packed by a bonded moving company and placed into a heavily secured storage facility under my name. You are currently trespassing in my property. If you attempt to return to that house tonight, the private security firm I hired will have you arrested for breaking and entering." The microphone slipped from Catherine's hand, hitting the stage floor with a loud, piercing screech of feedback that made several guests cover their ears. She did not even flinch. She simply stood there, a hollow shell of the terrifying matriarch who had ruled my life for 35 years. She had sacrificed her daughter, her grandson, and her morality to protect her son, and in return, her son had stolen the very roof over her head. Behind her, a sudden, ragged sound broke the silence. William, who had been listening to every word, staggered backward. His face had gone completely gray, his lips a frightening shade of blue. He reached out blindly, his hand grasping the air before he grabbed his chest. He let out a choked, desperate wheeze, his knees buckling beneath him. He sank heavily into a nearby dining chair, his expensive tuxedo jacket crumpling as he curled inward, struggling to pull air into his failing lungs. The financial annihilation of his legacy, combined with the absolute betrayal of his beloved son, was physically breaking him apart. A few hotel staff members rushed forward to assist him, but the rest of the ballroom remained frozen in place, watching the total, uncompromising destruction of the Sterling family. I did not move to help him. I had spent my entire life trying to save them from their own toxic choices, and I was finally permanently done. As William gasped for air and Catherine stared blankly at the deed to my new house, a sudden shift in lighting caught my eye. I looked past the sea of shocked guests, past the towering ice sculptures and the ruined champagne towers. Outside the massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors of the grand ballroom, the darkness of the city night was suddenly fractured. Flashing red and blue lights began to pulse against the glass, casting stark rotating shadows across the marble floor. Dozens of police cruisers and federal transport vehicles were pulling up to the main entrance of the hotel, forming an impenetrable barricade. The flashing lights illuminated Brandon's terrified face as the federal agents hauled him to his feet, pulling his wrists sharply behind his back to secure the steel cuffs. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom did not just open, they were thrust apart with an explosive force that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. A joint task force of the FBI and the local police department flooded into the entryway. The sheer number of tactical vests, federal windbreakers, and holstered weapons completely shattered the elegant, aristocratic illusion of the charity gala. The remaining musicians of the string quartet, who had been nervously holding their instruments in the corner, abruptly stopped playing. The sudden absolute silence in the massive space was deafening, broken only by the sharp rhythmic thud of heavy boots marching directly down the center aisle. The crowd of billionaires, hedge fund managers, and politicians parted like the Red Sea, scrambling over themselves to clear a path. Nobody wanted to be standing too close to the blast radius. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing woman, with a badge swinging from her belt, walked straight past me without a single glance. Her eyes were locked onto her target. She marched up to the overturned chairs of the VIP table where Jonathan Hayes's private security contractors were holding my brother. "Brandon Sterling," she announced, her voice projecting across the silent ballroom with clinical, practiced authority. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, federal wire fraud, and corporate embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Brandon's knees completely buckled. If the private security guards had not been holding him upright by his armpits, he would have collapsed flat onto the marble floor. The metallic, heavy clink of the steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed sharply through the room. The sound seemed to finalize his destruction. "Mom." Dad Brandon shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical wail. He thrashed his shoulders, desperately trying to pull away from the agents. "Do not let them take me. Call our lawyers. You have to do something. Tell them it is a mistake." But Catherine could not do anything. She was already on the floor. The paralyzing shock of the foreclosure revelation, combined with the horrifying reality of seeing her golden child dragged away in steel cuffs, had completely broken her mind. She fell heavily to her knees. The expensive custom blush pink silk of her designer gown soaked up the puddles of spilled champagne and dirt from the trampled floral centerpieces. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail that tore through the air, clawing at the stone floor with her manicured hands. Her perfectly styled hair fell in messy strands across her face. She wept uncontrollably, beating her fists against the ground. The untouchable, arrogant matriarch who had ruled the city's social elite for decades was gone, reduced to a ruined, pathetic spectacle, mourning the death of her empire. Jasmine was in no position to help her husband either. She was shivering near the base of the acrylic podium, desperately clutching the broken pieces of her multi-million-dollar diamond necklace against her chest. She watched in wide-eyed horror as a second FBI agent, a stern man with plastic evidence bags already in his hands, stepped over the torn tulle of her skirt. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to hand that over," the agent instructed flatly, pointing a gloved finger at the diamonds in her hands. Jasmine blinked rapidly, pulling the jewels tighter against her collarbone. "This is mine," she stammered, her voice shaking violently. "My husband gave this to me. It was an anniversary gift. You cannot take it." "It is evidence," the agent corrected, his tone completely devoid of sympathy or patience. "That necklace was purchased directly with stolen corporate funds routed through a fraudulent charity. Hand it over immediately, or you will be charged with obstruction of justice. And take off the matching earrings while you are at it." Slowly, humiliatingly, Jasmine opened her hands. She dropped the glittering, priceless stones into the plastic bag. With trembling fingers, she unclasped her diamond earrings and slid off her heavy platinum bracelets, dropping them into the bag as well. The agent sealed it with a loud final zip. Jasmine looked up, her face streaked with ruined mascara, staring out at the sea of socialites, executives, and politicians she had spent her entire adult life desperately trying to impress. They were not looking at her with envy anymore. They were looking at her with absolute disgust. Every single person in the front row had their smartphone raised, recording every second of her spectacular, humiliating strip-down. She was being socially executed on camera, and there was nowhere for her to hide. I stood motionless in the center of the chaos, watching the federal agents march Brandon down the aisle toward the exit. He was still sobbing, dragging his feet, leaving a trail of shattered dignity in his wake. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers parked outside pulsed rapidly through the massive glass doors of the ballroom, casting harsh, rotating shadows across the walls. Behind me, a raspy, desperate cough broke my focus. I turned around. William was still sitting in the dining chair where he had collapsed. His breathing had stabilized slightly, but his face remained a sickly, terrifying shade of gray. He was gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked past his wailing wife on the floor. He looked past the federal agents bagging his daughter-in-law's stolen jewelry. He looked directly at me. His eyes were wide and completely stripped of the arrogant, dismissive authority he had always weaponized against me. The absolute reality of his financial ruin had finally settled into his bones. "Where are we supposed to live, Melanie?" William rasped, his voice weak, trembling, and entirely devoid of pride. He stared at me as if I were a stranger holding the executioner's blade. "We have nothing left. We are your parents." I stared down at the man who had sired me. William Sterling, the great patriarch, was now just a hollow, trembling shell of a man sinking into a hotel dining chair. His skin was pale, his breathing shallow, his eyes begging for a lifeline he had never once offered me. Beside him, Catherine was still thrashing on the floor, her wails echoing against the vaulted ceilings, entirely consumed by the spectacle of her own ruin. For over 3 decades, I had craved my father's validation. I had worked myself to the bone, building my firm from the ground up, hoping that one day he would look at me with the same blind, unearned pride he showered upon Brandon. I had spent years making excuses for their absence. I justified why they missed my college graduation, why they skipped my business launch, and why they could never find the time to attend a single one of my son's school events. The mention of my son brought a sudden icy clarity to my mind. When my boy needed braces, when he needed a college fund, my parents claimed their assets were tied up in illiquid investments. Yet the financial records I had just audited proved they had systematically drained the family trust, including the portion legally designated for my child to cover Brandon's initial gambling debts before he resorted to corporate embezzlement. They had literally stolen from their own grandson to buy Brandon another season of pretending to be a master of the universe. I looked down at the people who had treated me and my son like disposable garbage for my entire life. I expected to feel a surge of vindictive joy. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional cord connecting me to them had completely severed. "Where are you supposed to live?" I repeated, my voice stripping away the last remnants of the Sterling family dignity. "That is not my problem, William. It has not been my problem since the day you decided my only purpose in this family was to serve as a backdrop for Brandon's greatness." Catherine stopped wailing for a fraction of a second, her tear-streaked face snapping upward to glare at me. "We are your blood," she shrieked, her voice scraping the back of her throat. "You cannot throw us out on the street. We gave you life, and you spent the rest of it trying to make me feel small," I replied, my tone lethally calm. "You made your choices. You chose the golden child. You enabled a criminal. You watched him hemorrhage money, and instead of stopping him, you mortgaged your home, and you stole from my child's future to fund his lies. You sacrificed your grandson's security so your precious son could buy sports cars and offshore bank accounts." William squeezed his eyes shut, tears finally spilling over his wrinkled cheeks. He knew I had seen the ledger. He knew the truth was indefensible. "I am not your safety net," I stated, my voice echoing through the silent, captivated ballroom. "I am the auditor who caught you. You have until Monday at 8 a.m. to remove your personal items from my property. After that, the locks are changed and anything left behind will be donated to an actual charity, not the fake one Jasmine just went down for." Catherine let out another feral scream, lunging forward as if she meant to grab my ankles. I simply took a step back, letting her grasp at the empty air. She collapsed back into the spilled champagne, her frantic sobbing mixing with the distant wail of police sirens outside. I did not offer another word. I turned my back on my screaming family. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Trust Charity Gala had become a graveyard for the city's elite, but as I began to walk down the center aisle, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The billionaires, the socialites, the hedge fund managers, and the local politicians did not look at me with pity. They looked at me with profound, unadulterated awe. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a wide, unobstructed path toward the heavy mahogany exit doors. Men and women who had spent the entire evening ignoring my presence at the kitchen table now physically stepped aside, pulling their silk gowns and tailored tuxedos out of my way. Whispers rippled through the room, but they were no longer mocking. They were murmuring the name of my firm. They were recognizing the woman who had single-handedly orchestrated the greatest financial takedown in Chicago history. I kept my head held high. My posture was flawless, the deep emerald silk of my gown catching the ambient light of the crystal chandeliers. My stiletto heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor. A steady, powerful heartbeat measuring my exit from a world that had never deserved me. I did not look back at the flashing red and blue lights illuminating Brandon being shoved into the back of a federal transport vehicle. I did not look back at Jasmine sitting in a ruined heap without her diamonds. I left them all in the wreckage of their own arrogant delusions. As I approached the grand exit, the heavy wooden doors were already propped open by hotel security. Standing right in the threshold, perfectly framed by the glowing city skyline beyond the lobby, was Jonathan Hayes. The CEO had bypassed the media circus outside and positioned himself squarely in my path. He was no longer looking at me as an aggrieved brother or a family outcast. He was looking at me as an equal. Jonathan pushed himself off the doorframe as I approached. He reached into the inside pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick leather-bound folder. He extended it toward me with a sharp, respectful nod. "I had my legal team draft this up while the feds were reading your brother his rights," Jonathan said, his deep voice carrying a note of genuine admiration. I stopped accepting the heavy folder. I opened the cover. Inside was a signed multi-million-dollar retainer contract. It was an exclusive agreement naming Apex Risk Management as the sole independent auditing firm for all of Jonathan's global corporate holdings, effectively doubling my company's valuation in a single signature. I closed the folder, meeting his gaze with a fierce, satisfied smile. "Pleasure doing business with you, Melanie," Jonathan said, extending his hand. I reached out and shook the hand of the most powerful man in the city. The grip was firm, sealing the end of the Sterling family myth and the absolute beginning of my own empire. The handshake with Jonathan Hayes felt like the final definitive gavel falling on the Sterling family dynasty. I walked out through the heavy glass doors of the luxury hotel and stepped into the cool, crisp Chicago night air. For the first time in 35 years, my lungs expanded completely. I was not carrying the crushing weight of my parents' expectations. I was not carrying the terrifying financial burden of my brother's catastrophic failures. I was simply Melanie, a woman who had faced down the monsters of her childhood and emerged completely victorious. 6 months passed with the rapid, exhilarating momentum of a life finally unchained. Apex Risk Management did not just grow, it utterly dominated the financial sector. Jonathan Hayes kept his word, integrating my firm into his global corporate structure as his lead independent auditor. Word of the Sterling takedown spread through the corporate world like wildfire. Companies did not just want an accountant. They wanted the ruthless, uncompromising auditor who possessed the precision to dismantle her own corrupt family. My calendar filled with high-level corporate audits, forensic accounting contracts, and international risk assessment consultations. The financial rewards followed swiftly. I moved Leo and myself out of our modest townhouse and into a stunning modern penthouse overlooking the deep blue expanse of Lake Michigan. It was a home purchased with clean, hard-earned money, completely devoid of any toxic family strings. Leo was enrolled in the city's top private academy. His college fund fully secured his future, completely insulated from the reckless greed of the Sterling name. The justice system moved with brutal efficiency when dealing with clear-cut federal wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. Brandon's highly paid, aggressive defense attorneys evaporated the exact moment the retainer checks bounced. Left with an overworked public defender and facing a mountain of undeniable forensic evidence, Brandon was forced to take a harsh plea deal. The former golden child of the Sterling family is currently serving a 10-year sentence in a federal correctional institution. There are no silk sheets, no luxury sports cars, and no wealthy parents to write a check and make his problems magically disappear. He spends his days working in the prison laundry facility, stripped of his custom designer suits and his unearned arrogance. He is just another inmate, serving time for stealing what did not belong to him. Jasmine did not stand by her man. The moment the federal agents confiscated her stolen diamonds at the gala, her loyalty completely dissolved. She filed for divorce before Brandon even had his first bail hearing. But abandoning a sinking ship did not save her from drowning. With the Sterling accounts frozen by the government and her own assets seized as proceeds of crime, Jasmine was violently expelled from the high society world she worshipped. She now lives in a tiny, dilapidated studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. The woman who once mocked my modest lifestyle now works a grueling retail job at a luxury boutique. She is forced to smile, bow, and fold clothes for the exact same wealthy socialites who used to attend her lavish charity galas. They look right through her, treating her like the hired help she always despised, pretending they never knew her name. As for William and Catherine, their eviction from the Sterling estate was prompt and uncompromising. At exactly 8 in the morning on that following Monday, my private security firm escorted them off the property. Stripped of their stolen equity and instantly dropped by every wealthy friend they had ever manipulated, they faced the brutal, unforgiving reality of the world they had always looked down upon. They now live in a cramped, drafty, one-bedroom rental apartment entirely dependent on William's monthly Social Security checks to survive. The towering, terrifying matriarch and the great commanding patriarch have been reduced to clipping coupons and counting pennies at the local grocery store. Their pride has been thoroughly and permanently shattered. On Thanksgiving and Christmas, my phone registers blocked call attempts from their numbers. They desperately want a lifeline, a connection to the daughter they threw away, but that door is permanently welded shut. I do not listen to the voicemails, I simply delete them without a second thought. The heavy oak doors of the five-star Chicago steakhouse swung open, ushering Leo and me into the warm, dimly lit dining room. The rich scent of roasted garlic, seared prime beef, and aged wine filled the air. It was the exact same restaurant where this entire ordeal had begun. The same restaurant where my parents had demanded I hand over my savings to bail out Brandon. The same table where they had treated Leo like a nuisance and treated me like a disposable ATM. But everything was different now. The maitre d' greeted us warmly by name, immediately leading us past the crowded main floor to the best booth in the house, a private, velvet-lined alcove overlooking the bustling city street. Leo slid into the booth, his eyes wide with excitement, completely untouched by the darkness of the family we had left behind in the ashes. A sharply dressed waiter approached our table, handing us the heavy leather-bound menus with a respectful nod. I did not even bother to open mine. I looked across the table at the bright, happy face of the boy who was the sole focus of my entire empire. "What are we having today, Leo?" I asked, my voice steady, light, and full of joy. Leo grinned, setting his menu down flat on the pristine white tablecloth. "The tomahawk steak, Mom. Extra sides." I smiled, a genuine, radiant expression of pure freedom. I reached into my custom designer purse and pulled out my heavy metal black card, placing it directly onto the table with a satisfying clink. "You heard the boss," I told the waiter. "Bring the tomahawk. Bring every extra side he wants. And when we are finished, bring the most expensive dessert on the menu. We have a lot to celebrate." The waiter smiled, scooping up the card and the menus. "Right away, ma'am." I leaned back against the plush velvet seat, watching Leo happily arrange his silverware. The noise of the restaurant faded into a comforting, peaceful hum. There were no more threats hanging over my head. There were no more financial manipulations draining my accounts. There was no more desperately trying to earn love that was never meant for me. There was only total victory, unbothered peace, and the sweet, absolute taste of complete financial and emotional independence. The story of Melanie's triumph over her toxic family serves as a powerful reminder that our worth is not defined by those who fail to value us. It highlights the critical importance of setting firm boundaries and reclaiming one's narrative after years of emotional manipulation and neglect. By turning her pain into fuel for success, Melanie demonstrates that true independence, both financial and emotional, is the ultimate victory against familial betrayal. It is a testament to the sheer strength required to walk away from toxic environments and build a life grounded in self-respect. What is your biggest takeaway from Melanie's journey? Let me know in the comments below.